Could this be the face of the Zodiac Killer? October 6, 2021, the nonprofit group The Casebreakers, a team of 40 independent investigators devoted to cold cases, made the bombshell announcement. After more than 53 years of speculation, expert and amateur theories, the Zodiac Killer could finally be identified. His name? Gary Francis Post. We've talked about the Zodiac Killer a lot, but just in case you need a refresher, for 10 months from December 20th, 1968 to October 11th, 1969, 5 people were murdered in the San Francisco Bay Area. The first two, David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were teenagers, shot to death on Lake Herman Road in Benicia. Next, on July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron and Mike Majou were shot while parked in Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Majou survived, Farron did not. An anonymous caller notified the police, taking responsibility and also confessing to the Benicia murders. On August 1st, 3 letters were sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, taking credit for the crimes and demanding publication. That meant including a 3-part cryptogram that the writer claimed would reveal his identity. On August 7th, he wrote a subsequent letter giving details only the police could corroborate, and naming himself the Zodiac. On September 27th, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Ann Shepard were attacked by a hooded man at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. They were tied up, then stabbed multiple times. Hartnell survived, Shepard did not. 2 weeks later, on October 11th, cab driver Paul Stein was shot in the head in Presidio Heights. 3 teens witnessed the killer leave the cab. The Zodiac later wrote taking credit and proved it by enclosing a piece of Stein's bloody shirt. While there have been no confirmable Zodiac murders since, he continued a correspondence with the police and press, claiming 37 kills. So, why do the Casebreakers think Post is their guy? According to the official press release, it's been years in the making. They identify, quote, outlaw-turned-Zodiac whistleblower Will, unquote, who claims he was part of a posse run by Post near High Sierra mountain range in California. Will said he even saw Post bury a cache of weapons used in the Zodiac killings up in the mountains. He tried for years to convince authorities Post was the killer, but no one seemed interested, until he met California news anchor Dale Hulin. Dale heard Will's story and brought it to the attention of the Casebreakers. Subsequent eyewitnesses agree. These include a former neighbor whom Post and his wife used to babysit, who claims that as a toddler she was taken by Post to the nearby woods and taught how to shoot. He even gave her a .22 pistol of her own and made similar gifts to members of his posse. The organization's intel expert Eric Kleinsmith says one witness saw a mechanism in Post's home that could manufacture a postage stamp, thus obfuscating his whereabouts. Post was a former Air Force radar technician, also owned a pair of military-issued Air Force Wingwalker boots, similar to those that made prints leaving the scene of the crime at Lake Berryessa. Post had scars from a 1959 car crash that seemed to match the markings on the face of the police composite sketch based on the Presidio Heights teens' accounts and corroborated by Kathleen Johns. And while the tauntings continued throughout the 70s, Kleinsmith points out that the Zodiac killings stopped when Post got married. And if all that wasn't enough, Casebreakers founder Thomas J. Colbert claims to have 6 eyewitnesses, 3 of them via sworn affidavits, who say Post actually told them he was the Zodiac. For Casebreakers, though, the key was the Cypher. The Zodiac's coded messages are infamous. The first was broken by a high school teacher and his wife. One was not solved until 2020, but some remain unsolved, baffling expert codebreakers from around the world. Allegedly, Dale was told that Post's full name is the key to breaking the cipher. He brought this up to the Casebreakers, who consulted other code-breaking experts, and apparently it's a match. Using Post's name is the key to deciphering the letters. Any more details? Not quite. For one thing, no one can ask Post himself. He died in 2018. And in an interview with a YouTuber, Peter A. Turner, Kleinsmith admitted the lack of resources is holding up some verification. The hidden cache of weapons buried somewhere in the High Sierras? Kleinsmith says they don't have the skill, equipment, or legal permission to make that difficult hike and investigate, though they hope they can get organized soon. The ciphers? As with past attempts at breaking the Zodiac's codes, the FBI will have to verify. The DNA? There is some of Post available, apparently taken by police following an instance of domestic abuse later in his life. This will have to be officially verified by the FBI, which is a bit trickier. There is no confirmed Zodiac DNA at any of the crime scenes. The closest police have come is from the saliva on the stamps used to mail the Zodiac's mocking letters. So far, that partial profile has only been used to rule suspects out. The Casebreakers are also concerned with linking the murder of Sherry Jo Bates to Post, and therefore the Zodiac. For decades, people have speculated that Bates was one of Zodiac's early victims. She was found stabbed to death on October 31, 1966, in Riverside, California. 10 feet from the body was a paint-splattered watch and a footprint made by a military-style boot. Bates had apparently fought her assailant, catching their skin and hair under her fingernails. Palm and fingerprints not belonging to her or any of her friends and family were also found inside her car. Later, letters boasting of the crime were sent to police, the press, and Bates's father. An anonymous letter sent to the San Francisco Chronicle's Paul Avery told the reporter to look into similarities between the Bates case and the Zodiac murders. Handwriting expert Sherwood Morrill believed the letter to Bates's father matched the Zodiac's letters, and the Zodiac killer even claimed Bates as one of his victims in a letter to the Los Angeles Times from 1971. The FBI officially considers Bates one of the Zodiac's victims. The Riverside police are more skeptical. As recently as August 2021, they revealed that the writer of the initial letters was known to them. The culprit made a confession anonymously in 2016. Police managed to track him down by, yes, DNA analysis from the saliva on the stamp used. Further investigation and further confession confirmed that the man wrote the letters in 1966, but was neither Bates's killer nor connected to the Zodiac murders. He had just been a troubled teen seeking attention. The department's official website hints that they have their own prime suspect unconnected to any of the Bay Area murders, and their investigation continues on that path. Zodiac or not, could there still be a connection between Post and Bates's murder? At the time of the murder, Post was no longer with the Air Force, but still received checkups and medical attention at the hospital on March Air Force Base. The base is just 10 miles from Riverside City College, where Bates's body was found, a 15-minute drive. Post was also a house painter for 40 years. Remember the paint-spattered watch found near the body? So far, the Riverside Police Department has declined the case-breakers' demand that they compare the DNA evidence from the Bates crime scene, still in storage, to Post's DNA. And there is no doubt DNA comparisons could help. It was DNA that finally shattered a favorite theory for Zodiac enthusiasts, Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was either interviewed or had his property searched by the police frequently over a period of 20 years. In 1969, he was questioned by the police when it was discovered that he was in the Lake Berryessa area the day of the Hartnell Shepard attacks. And a so-called friend of his, Don Chaney, approached the police in 1971. He claimed Allen told him that Allen wanted to kill people. Allen also owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch, a brand not really related to the murders except for the name and the symbol, the very same crosshairs that the killer used as his signature. He liked to be called by his middle name, Lee, and one of the victims, Darlene Farron, was said to have been friends with a mystery man named Lee. Besides, he was a known creep, with a record of sexual assaults and misconduct against young boys. Mike Majou, a survivor of one of the Zodiac attacks, identified Allen via photo lineup, albeit 23 years after the fact. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. But circumstantial evidence isn't definitive evidence. Some noted that Majou's assertion contradicted his initial eyewitness description of his attacker. Others pointed out that Allen was balder, rounder, taller, and 100 pounds heavier than any Zodiac description. His handwriting didn't match, nor did his palm print match anything collected at the crime scenes. Even Detective Dave Toshi, the lead investigator for the San Francisco Police Department, said, "Allen looked very, very good for a while, but everything's turned out to be negative." It wasn't until 2002 when DNA evidence from one of the Zodiac's letters would rule him out. Even Don Chaney's DNA was tested just to make sure. Nothing. Which is why some Zodiac experts are already meeting this Post news with some skepticism. They've all seen this before. So what if friends and family members say Post was the Zodiac? He's not the first to be accused by so-called loved ones. Allen, remember, was tipped to the cops by a friend. And even some of his relatives had their suspicions, but Allen wasn't the only one. In 2015, Gary Stewart researched his biological father, Earl Van Best. His search, he claims, revealed that after abandoning Gary in Baton Rouge in 1962, he moved on to California and became the Zodiac Killer. If you'd like to know more, you can read Stewart's book on the subject, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, or check out the original docuseries based on the book. In 2014, Randy Kenny told the press his friend Louis Myers confessed to the killings in April 2001. Myers would have been 17 at the time, and Kenny says the infamous Halloween card Paul Avery received in 1970 was the key to the whole thing. The inside says "for teen," not a kill count but a hint to look for a teen. Kenny claims that Myers went to school with some of his victims. Myers died in May 2002, but made Kenny swear that he would write and publish a book about Myers' allegations, with proceeds going to the victims' families, of course. In 2009, Deborah Perez of Corona, California claimed her father, Guy Ward Hendrickson, was the Zodiac Killer. She went further, actually saying that when she was 7 years old, he had her write the letters, lick the stamps, and sew the mask he wore. She also happened to be working on a documentary on the subject. Her half-sister claims it's all lies. In 2006, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel released his best-selling book, The Black Dahlia Avenger. The book made a convincing case that his father, George Hodel, killed Elizabeth Short, another legendary cold case victim who was murdered and mutilated in Los Angeles in 1947. As we said, it was a bestseller, praised by critics and police. Less praised was his 2009 follow-up where he claimed his father was also the Zodiac Killer, and Chicago Lipstick Killer of 1945 and the Manila Jigsaw Murderer in 1967. So yes, while some are greeting the news of Post's identification with a sigh of finally, others look at the news with crossed arms and an arched brow. After all, the founder of Casebreakers, Thomas Colbert, used to work in production in Hollywood. In one interview, Eric Kleinsmith made sure to plug the team's upcoming docuseries about their investigation of the D.B. Cooper case, coming to a prestige streaming service. And their press release emphasizes twice that the guy who broke the case for them, Dale Julian, has written a, quote, copyrighted book manuscript on the subject. December 20th, 1968, two high school students named Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday are making out in a car on a dark road nicknamed Lover's Lane. Suddenly, a man appears out of nowhere and orders the love-struck teens to get out of the vehicle. Faraday gets out first, at which point he's shot and killed. Jensen makes a run for it and is shot 5 times in the back. This was the work of the Zodiac, perhaps America's most mysterious killer, a maniac still in the crosshairs of law enforcement today, and a man that just spoke again after half a decade of silence. Around 6 months after that murder, 3 newspapers received a letter each from a person who claimed he was the killer. In the letters, the person included a cryptogram that, after being cracked, seemed to reference a book about hunting. But not about animal hunting, it was about hunting humans for sport. His victims, he wrote, would become his slave in the afterlife. This is the Zodiac speaking would become 5 words that etched themselves into the minds of millions of Americans after more brutal murders and bewildering letters. The killer was playing with the cops. He was needling them, trolling them, so much so that he drove some investigators nearly out of their minds. And then came the unsolvable puzzle, the Zodiac's pièce de résistance, a cipher so perplexing that not even the greatest code-breaking minds in the world could solve it. Until now, anyway. It's taken 51 years to finally solve the puzzle, and it's revealed a chilling message. Okay, so first you need to know a bit more about the person known as the Zodiac Killer. It's something we've covered in detail before, so we'll give you an abridged version of this rather long and very disturbing tale. Spoiler alert, the cops never caught him. Should they have? You can tell us at the end. It's possible he started this journey as a ruthless killer with those 2 young lovers, but it's also possible the Zodiac had actually killed before. We may never know for sure, but in a letter he once claimed to have killed as many as 37 people. The police, though, have only ever definitively linked him to the killing of 5 people. In all likelihood, the Zodiac's body count was way higher, and he might have carried on killing for decades. His last letter came in 1974, and then, like a ghost, he just disappeared. That letter contained a postmark saying, "If I don't see this note in your paper, I'll do something nasty, which you know I'm capable of." He then wrote me 37 SFPD 0. Such letters infuriated the police, especially when he wrote things such as, "I like killing people because it's so much fun." For the cops, it was only a matter of time before they caught the maniac, but they were wrong, very wrong. It's certain the Zodiac murdered 22-year-old Darlene Elizabeth Farron and almost killed 19-year-old Mike Renault Mageau as they sat in their car in a secluded section of Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. The killer pulled up behind them at one point and then drove away. When he returned, he got out of his car and shined a bright light into the couple's car. He shot Farron 5 times and Mageau 4 times. She died, but he lived to tell the tale. Cops now knew they were looking for a male possibly in his late 20s, early 30s. He was about 5'8" and on the stocky side. He had brown hair and a roundish face. Mageau might have gotten some details wrong, but who takes notes when you have a gun in your face? How did the police know it was the Zodiac Killer? Well, he had the gumption to call them from a payphone only a few blocks away from the station, less than an hour after the attack. He told them details about the murder only the killer could possibly know, like what weapon was used. And then he shocked the cops by saying he was also the one who killed the kids on Lover's Lane. So if it wasn't a one-off killer, it was the work of a serial killer. Since the woman was cheating on her husband, he was a suspect for a while, but it didn't take long to figure out it wasn't him. The Zodiac was real. He was far from finished. So now we need to talk about ciphers and cryptograms. A cryptogram is like a puzzle that contains encrypted symbols. It might look like gibberish, but it has a hidden meaning. To figure out that meaning, you need a kind of key to decode it called a cipher. Anyone can create one with a little bit of research, and if you're the clever sort, you can even create a cryptogram that's next to impossible to decipher. Seeing as it took 51 years to crack one of the Zodiac's puzzles, well, you say criticize him all you want for his brutality, but you can't underestimate the man's brain power. His first cryptogram was the 408, which is called that because that's how many total symbols are in it. It was published by the San Francisco Chronicle and 2 other newspapers that were each sent different parts of the puzzle, and the public was asked to solve it. A couple of teachers in California named Donald Gein and Betty June Harden did just that, and it only took them 20 hours. Strange, since the so-called experts had failed where they succeeded. There's actually a conspiracy theory that the 2 were the Zodiac, but that's a story for another day. So in all, this cryptogram contained 54 different cipher symbols and 25 letters that are in the English alphabet. The couple worked out that they were looking at what's called a homophonic substitution cipher, which basically means you replace one letter with another, say a D for an M. It gets tricky though when one letter can be replaced by 5 different letters. The couple cracked it though, and this is how the decoded message began. I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It's even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. He then goes on about slaves in the afterlife and paradise, so despite being very clever, the Zodiac may also be suffering from mental illnesses, and he wasn't finished killing. Just over a month later, he struck again. This time, he picked on 2 Pacific Union College students named Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. They were enjoying a picnic at a bucolic spot next to Lake Berryessa in California's beautiful Napa Valley. The pair might have received the shock of their lives when they saw a man that looked like a vision from hell walking toward their very secluded spot. It was a man about 5'11", average weight, wearing what looked like an executioner's hood. They couldn't see his eyes though, due to the fact that he was wearing sunglasses over the mask's eye holes. If that wasn't frightening enough, he was also wearing what looked like a child's bib. On that bib was his now famous crossed circle symbol. The couple were absolutely petrified but didn't move since the maniac approaching them was clasping a handgun. He told them not to worry and told them a story about being a convict on the run. He subsequently told the young man to tie up his girlfriend with plastic clothesline that the supposed convict just happened to have handy. The Zodiac then tied up the man himself. What happened next is usually what only happens in horror movies featuring college students that drive out to the woods or a lake, even though they're warned not to do so by a peculiar-looking gas station owner. The Zodiac started going crazy, stabbing them both in the back. He stabbed the man 6 times and the woman 10 times. Leaving them for dead, the Zodiac walked about 500 yards to where the couple's car was parked, and there he drew his symbol on the door and wrote Vallejo 12/20/68, 7/4/69, September 27/69, 6:30 by knife. That evening, the Zodiac got the Napa Police Department on the phone and told them that he really was behind the double murder at the lake. The cops later discovered he'd made that call from a Napa car wash that was just around the corner from their department. The cops got a lead from this though because they managed to get some prints from the phone. Not only that, the kids he stabbed weren't dead. They were discovered inches from death, having lost a ton of blood. The girl told the cops what she'd seen, but not long after she fell into a coma and died in the hospital 2 days later. The man survived though and told the cops everything he knew. The police also had other clues, such as tire tracks most likely from the killer's car and his size 10.5 wing walker boot prints. Now cops knew they were looking for a true American psycho. Soon after, the Zodiac struck again, this time murdering a taxi driver named Paul Stein with a bullet to the back of the head. 3 days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter from the Zodiac containing a piece of Stein's shirt. There was no doubt that it was the real deal. The Zodiac said in the letter that the cops could have caught him if they had been doing their job correctly. He also wrote, "School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." Just over a week later, someone claiming to be the Zodiac called the Oakland Police Department. The person demanded that either one of the 2 big shot lawyers, F. Lee Bailey or Melvin Belly, go to a popular local talk show hosted by a man named Jim Dunbar. Belly did just that and appealed for the killer to call in. A man who said he was the Zodiac did call. He said, "I need help. I'm sick. I don't want to go to the gas chamber." And he even said he'd meet with Belly, but in the end he didn't turn up. As you'll soon find out, there was likely more to that call than first meets the eye. This finally brings us to that unbreakable puzzle. Not long after that no-show with the lawyer, the Chronicle received a new communication from the Zodiac. This time, it was a cryptogram containing 340 characters, which came to be known as Cypher 340, and it proved to be too difficult for the best minds in the world to decipher at the time. People tried for decades from the USA and across the world, but what the Zodiac Killer had created was something special, something so annoyingly difficult that after years of trying and failing, the puzzle was forgotten by most code crackers. Maybe it was meaningless, they thought, an assumption that put their frustrated minds at ease. But then in 2006, a global team of crack code breakers took a look at the impossible puzzle again. They knew it meant something, but finding the key was no easy task. It would end up taking them 14 years to finally decipher the code. That's dedication. The team included an American software developer named David Aranchak, a computer programmer from Belgium named Jarl van Eyck, and an Australian mathematician named Sam Blake. Their hard work finally brought the words of the Zodiac to the public. Eyck had actually developed software to break the codes, and he had created it specifically to crack the one made by the Zodiac. Blake's role in figuring out the cipher was to manipulate the symbols and see how they could be transposed, and Aranchak did the rest. The team said at times they'd get somewhere with the puzzle and they'd find a word, but then they discovered that what they discovered was a false positive, what they called a phantom. Then one day Aranchak announced, "This is a big one. We have a solution for the 340 and it's real." It hadn't been easy. The team had looked at hundreds of thousands of different manipulations of the text. Then on a Thursday morning at the beginning of December 2020, a variation of the text showed up in the program. Aranchak said at first sight it looked like gibberish, but it also contained the words gas chamber and the even more Zodiac-esque phrase, "Hope you're trying to catch me." That was a signature Zodiac taunt. If those phrases were actually part of the correct solution to the puzzle, what the team would have to do is apply a cipher that had been used for those words to the rest of the symbols in the cryptogram. It was complicated. They realized they had to look at the puzzle and read it in a diagonal fashion, so they took the symbol in the top left-hand corner and wrote it down. So if it was an H, they'd write H. Then they'd move down one and over to the right 2 spaces, then they'd write down that symbol, which here is a plus sign. Then they went through the entire puzzle doing this until they'd written down every symbol. What they ended up with was a completely different looking puzzle. It still looked like nonsense, of course, but now they had something new that they could put into the code-breaking software. The team was rather disappointed after that. Not only did not much of anything come up, but the terms gas chamber and hope you're trying to catch me weren't there either. It was as if they'd gone backward. But then Aranchak tried something else. He added the words they suspected were correct, gas chamber and hope you're trying to catch me, to the software as known solutions and let the program run. Presto, an English message popped up, the words of the Grandmaster Secret Code Psycho, the Zodiac himself. That wasn't me on the TV show. Was this the Zodiac telling the cops that the guy that had called in to talk to the lawyer was an imposter? Aranchak almost fell out of his chair. After 51 years, it was as if the Zodiac had risen from the grave. The team could now decrypt the first part of the puzzle, but the same method of code breaking didn't work for the other 2 parts. Since the first part was almost definitely correct, it didn't make sense that the other sections couldn't be solved in the same way. But then they hypothesized that the reason it didn't work was because the Zodiac had actually made a mistake when he designed the cipher. If that was the case, it was no wonder no one could crack it. You can't open a broken lock with a good key. The team took into consideration that he'd made some spelling mistakes. They corrected the mistakes and then used a slightly different system of moving down and to the right diagonally reading the symbols, and they discovered something amazing. It worked. The Zodiac really had made a mistake in his code. And here it is, the fully decrypted words of the Zodiac himself from a code that remained unbroken for over 50 years. He wrote, "I hope you're having lots of fun in trying to catch me." That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I'm not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise. So they're afraid of death. I'm not afraid, because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death. It was true. The man who called and spoke to Melvin Belly really was an imposter. The Zodiac had always been somewhat narcissistic in his writing. He'd always bragged about being one step ahead of the cops. He never seemed scared or repentant, like how the caller sounded. The Zodiac, perhaps suffering from a mental illness, actually believed his victims could be waiting on him hand and foot in the afterlife. It appears he didn't believe the heaven-hell dichotomy for good guys and bad guys. The team didn't waste any time in contacting the FBI to alert them that they'd cracked the puzzle. The FBI subsequently issued a statement saying it was true, and while it's exciting and a huge accomplishment to finally have cracked the code, it didn't actually get us any closer to understanding the true identity of America's most confounding serial killer. The message doesn't really help the investigation at all, which the FBI says is still ongoing. "We continue to seek justice for the victims of these brutal crimes," wrote the agency. But that's not the end of the Zodiac story when it comes to codes. There are 2 more ciphers that were sent by the Zodiac that haven't yet been solved. They are both very short, and some people believe one of them could even be his name. Being short doesn't make a cipher easier though, far from it. Because it's short, there are fewer clues for a key. The 340 cipher team has tried to crack those remaining puzzles, but suspects that because it's so short, unless new information is discovered, it's likely a hopeless task. And so while the code is cracked, the identity of the Zodiac killer remains a mystery. People will continue trying though, and who knows, maybe one day someone will finally solve the last of the masked maniac's mysteries and will finally learn the truth of just who the Zodiac killer is.
Following our show on the infamous serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, we thought we'd look at another equally fascinating crime story, that of the Zodiac killer, that has baffled both investigators and the public alike. These 2 beasts were not the only prolific killers never to be caught, but perhaps the most well-known. Other serial killers that got away with it include the Atlanta Ripper, India's Stone Man, the Axeman of New Orleans, and one person that had the terrifying name of the Babysitter. There are plenty more, but maybe none who led police on such a confounding wild goose chase as the person we are going to discuss today. So wrap your heads around this episode of the infographic show, The Zodiac Serial Killer. How did he evade the police? "I like killing people because it's so much fun." These were the chilling words written in a letter by someone we know as the Zodiac Killer. But where did the killing begin? Well, the Zodiac, a name he gave to himself in the letters he sent to police, claimed to have killed 37 people in total, but that may not be the case. Police are pretty sure he killed at least 5 people and injured 2 others, but they also say there is a possibility he was responsible for another 20 to 28 murders. The earliest confirmed murder didn't take place until 1968, but it's widely believed that the Zodiac was working much earlier than that. The first confirmed murders were those of a young couple, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, killed on December 20th, 1968. The couple pulled into a place named Lover's Lane, probably about to reach first base on what was said to be their first date. They didn't get too far because a man approached their vehicle and shot the man in the head. The girl ran, but was shot 5 times in the back. A few months later, the Zodiac would claim these murders as his own, and he would share details only the killer could have known. You can go back much earlier though to 1963, and again, this terrorizer of the night picked on young people. High school lovers Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards used Senior Ditch Day to go for a sunbathe at Gaviota State Park in California. They never made it home. The boys' dad found the bodies after becoming worried about his son being out for a long time. When he went to the beach to look for them, he found both his son and the girlfriend tied up. The boy had been shot 11 times and the girl 9 times. This may or may not have been our man. Did the Zodiac kill 18-year-old Sherry Josephine Bates, brutally stabbed several times and her throat slashed so hard it almost decapitated her? That was in 1966, and it was some years later that police thought this too could have been the work of the Zodiac. Police are sure the Zodiac almost killed 19-year-old Michael Magoo and did kill his 22-year-old girlfriend Darlene Ferrin. Both were shot in 1969 while sitting in their car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. The killer later called the police and described exactly what had happened. He finished the chilling call saying, "I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." He was referring to Jensen and Faraday. Perhaps the grisliest confirmed crime was that of 2 lovers, 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Ann Shepard. The pair were relaxing at a lake in Napa County, California, when a man in a hooded costume with the Zodiac emblem sewed on it told them he was a prison escapee. He bound them with clothesline while they were on their backs. He then stabbed the boy 6 times in the back, turned to the screaming girl and stabbed her 10 times. Hartnell actually survived. The killer then went up to the couple's car and scrawled in pen some information about the other murders. Hartnell unfortunately wasn't able to give police much information about the man that almost took his life. The last confirmation, and perhaps the closest the Zodiac came to being caught, was when he shot 28-year-old Paul Stein in the back of his head from his taxicab in San Francisco. He only just got away as police approached the scene, but for some reason the cops were looking for a black suspect. The cops thought it was a robbery until shortly after the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter signed from the Zodiac. The letter stated, "I am the murderer of the taxi driver." And just to be sure the police believed him, also inside the letter was a piece of the bloodstained shirt that Stein had been wearing on the night. People did see a man near the cab that night though, and now police thought they had some idea concerning what he looked like. The Zodiac said that was a bad version of him, stating in a letter that the night of the murder he was wearing a disguise. There were many more suspected murders, but we can't go through them all. Let's talk about these letters instead, most of which were written with terrible handwriting. The first letter sent in 1966 was titled The Confession. He gets straight to the point, starting with the lines, "She was young and beautiful, but now she is battered and dead. She is not the first and she will not be the last." Still, it's thought this could have been any delusional person, perhaps not the actual Zodiac killer. Many more letters are suspected to have come from the Zodiac, but others have been confirmed. On July 31st, it's thought the Zodiac sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times. Each newspaper had been sent one part of something called a Cypher. This may also be called a cryptogram, and is a coded way of sending a message. In this case, it was a block of letters and symbols. The Zodiac was some trickster. While he later wrote a letter saying the cipher contained his name, it was actually later discovered to have said, "I will not give you my name." He sent a series of letters, sometimes with ciphers. The first cipher, when worked out, contained a message, part of which read, "The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all those that I have killed will become my slaves." He even wrote to Chronicle reporter Paul Avery, who had been working on the case. It was a Halloween card that contained the text, "Peekaboo, you are doomed." This was a threat, a matter that became serious for Avery. Despite what the Zodiac movie tells us, it was later said by Avery's friends and colleagues that the case didn't drive him to drugs and drink and his eventual death. That part is fiction, said the people. The last letter received was on January 29, 1974. In this letter, the Zodiac wrote that the film The Exorcist was a great satirical comedy. He left a symbol that has never been explained, and like that, he was gone. So, why was he never caught? Well, firstly, some people do think the police had their man, they just didn't have the sufficient evidence to get a conviction. The prime suspect has always been Arthur Lee Allen, and he's the only one that police gained search warrants for. Several police officers have said they thought it was him. Robert Graysmith, the cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle who was very close to the case at the time of the murders, wrote a book called Zodiac, and in it, he puts Allen as the main culprit. Police were all over him for almost 20 years and in the end, had a lot of leads. Bloody knives in his car, matching footprints at the murder scene, a knowledge of ciphers, a positive ID from a survivor, being seen close to one killing, other people saying he had bragged about killing and had talked about naming himself Zodiac. He even had a history of abusing children and an apparent hatred for women, although police said they just could not find enough evidence to convict him. So perhaps it's as simple as that. Cops had their man, but he slipped through their hands. His handwriting didn't match, and neither did his DNA on the envelopes of the Zodiac letters. Allen was found dead in 1992 at his home. Was it Richard Gaykowski, a good fit for the sketch, mentally unstable, and most of all linked to the ciphers that were sent? Still, the man's friends have given him solid alibis for some of the murders. Was it Earl Van Best Jr., an absolute dead ringer for the Zodiac sketch, and his name seems to appear in the ciphers? Some people have said it might have been the Unabomber, aka Theodore J. Kaczynski, but given his intellect, modus operandi, and of course his twisted but profound reason for killing, it just wouldn't make sense. One connection we suppose is that they both wrote to newspapers to spread the news of their wicked game. Was it Ricky Marshall, who owned a typewriter and liked the same movies as the Zodiac? That's hardly a strong case. Was it mentally ill Lawrence Kane, who knew coding, whose name may have been in the ciphers, and who was actually a colleague of one of the victims? What about Ross Sullivan, another mentally ill man that was close to the location of the murders and a good fit for the sketch? And guess what? The Zodiac once mentioned the opera The Mikado, written by none other than Gilbert and Sullivan. The list goes on, but these guys have all been discussed widely by people that have followed the case professionally, and also all those online sleuths we have these days. There are plenty of zodiologists out there, and many have differing opinions. Why was he never caught? Many hypotheses have been put forward, from bad police work, different police departments working on the case and not communicating well, to good old plain luck on the killer side, to the fact the killer was likely not related in any way to any of the victims. They usually are, even if it means they regularly catch the same bus. He chose his locations carefully, for the most part, which were often totally remote and far from each other. We might also add that back in the 60s and 70s, the forensic technology was primitive compared to now. These days, it's likely his murders would not have only been on CCTV, but they'd be going viral after being posted on something like LiveLeak. Even the lead investigator on the Zodiac case doesn't know why they didn't catch him in the end. His name was Dave Tashi, and we'll leave you with something he said. Why didn't we get this guy? I ended up with a bleeding ulcer over this case. It still haunts me, it always will. He's dead now. Rest in peace, Dave.
December 20th, 1968. Around 10:15 p.m., 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen parked at a gravel turnout, a well-known popular lover's lane on Lake Herman Road, In the small Northern California town of Benicia, sadly, the teenage sweethearts never made it home after their date. They were found shot to death shortly after 11 p.m. Thus began the reign of terror by the Zodiac Killer. From December 1968 through October 1969, a serial killer who came to be known as the Zodiac Killer from the cryptic letters he sent to the press plagued the California Bay Area. Despite his brazen crimes and his clues to the authorities, the Zodiac Killer was never caught. A number of suspects have been named by law enforcement and amateur investigators over the years, but there has been no definitive proof as to who the Zodiac Killer was. There are a lot of reasons why the Zodiac Killer was never found. But first, a quick rundown of the depraved acts that made him so notorious. Nearly 7 months after the murders in Benicia, the Zodiac Killer struck again. On July 4, 1969, another young man and woman, Michael Mageau and Darlene Farron, were shot in Vallejo, California around midnight as they sat in a car parked at a golf course. The killer actually called the police from a payphone at about 12:40 a.m. and reported the double murder, also mentioning that he had killed the kids last year, in reference to the Benicia slayings. Mageau survived the attack but wasn't able to provide a description to the police. On July 31, 1969, the Zodiac Killer sent letters to 3 local newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each of these letters contained a confession of the 2 murders and 1/3 of a cipher. When assembled and cracked, the cipher discussed how much the Zodiac Killer liked killing. On September 27, 1969, came the 3rd attack. One evening, 2 college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing by the shore of Lake Berryessa, about 25 miles from Napa, California, when they were approached by a man wearing a homemade executioner's mask. He claimed to be an escaped prison convict who was trying to get to Mexico. He needed the students' money and car. He tied them up and then, without warning, pulled out a knife and stabbed them. Then, he used a marker to vandalize Brian's car, memorializing his killing before making his escape. Again, the killer called the police from a payphone to alert them about the attack. Meanwhile, Good Samaritans had found the victims and they were rushed to the hospital. Miraculously, Hartnell survived his stabbing. A 4th attack happened on October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights area of San Francisco. The Zodiac Killer shot a cab driver, Paul Stein, and then cut off and stole a part of the cabbie's bloody shirt. From then on, the killer sent taunting letters to the press and the police, referring to himself as the Zodiac and discussing the mystical and intellectual basis of his motivation for the killings. He also provided unknown details of his crimes, made threats, and offered puzzles and coded clues to future murder plots. Twice, he even included pieces of Stein's bloody shirt with his letters as proof. The 4th attack was the final one. For the next 5 years, the Zodiac Killer continued to send letters to the media and authorities until 1974. Though he may have sent correspondence until 1978, no one can be sure if all the messages received really came from the killer. Over time, the authorities have interviewed nearly 2,500 people regarding the crimes. Due to the killer's communication with newspapers, which somewhat sensationally printed his letters, the public was highly interested in the Zodiac Killer. Even today, tips still pour in and people have confessed to being the Zodiac Killer and made accusations to authorities that various family members or colleagues were the Zodiac Killer. Internet groups pore over every detail of the crimes in an attempt to crack the killer's identity. So far, only one of the 4 pictograms sent by the killer has ever been decoded. One of the 3 unsolved puzzles allegedly provides the name of the Zodiac Killer. Here are some reasons as to why the Zodiac Killer was never found. Number 1. The locations the murder took place in. The Zodiac Killer murdered his victims during the course of about a year over a wide-ranging area. The first 2 murders took place 7 months apart in Benicia and Vallejo, California. Though the 2 murder scenes were less than 5 miles apart, they were in different municipalities and were therefore investigated by different police departments, as was the 3rd attack near Napa and the 4th attack in San Francisco. 4 separate jurisdictions with different processes separately worked the cases during a time when each police department was an entity into itself, which leads us to the next reason why the Zodiac Killer wasn't caught. Number 2. Mishandled police work. A variety of police mistakes were made with the Zodiac cases. During the Zodiac Killer's final attack, witnesses called the police to alert them of a cab driver being shot by a middle-aged white male. On the first report over the police radio, the operator described the shooter as a black male. Because of the mistaken description, 2 officers ignored a white man who crossed their paths as they were arriving to the crime scene. In one of his letters, the Zodiac Killer sent a swatch of the cabbie's blood-stained shirt and taunted the police for their mistake in not apprehending him when they had the chance. An ongoing mistake that all the jurisdictions were guilty of was lack of information sharing. During the 1960s, there was very little interagency cooperation. Different jurisdictions were possessive of their cases. Red tape and egos got in the way. Even when the police wanted to share case files, it was harder to share back then. Which once again brings us to the next reason why the Zodiac Killer wasn't caught. Number 3. The time period. During the Zodiac Killer's spree, there was no ease of sharing information via technology. There were no fax machines, no computers, no cellular phones, no AFIS, automated fingerprint identification system. Also, the police may have had too much information and trouble parsing it. Once the Zodiac Killer's correspondence was published, the police were inundated with a wide variety of tips from the public. Beyond all the technology and software which helps police gather data and analyze cases, modern forensics was still in its infancy. Crime scene investigation, CSI, was minimal, and the evidence collected wasn't well preserved. Since then, pieces of evidence have been endlessly handled by the police. The Zodiac case was so popular and had developed such a mystique that evidence was sought out by curious authorities not directly working the case. Over the years, evidence has been rifled through, taken home by retiring cops who wanted to continue to work the case, and even stolen as souvenirs. Of course, DNA testing wasn't yet possible at the time of the crimes. Since then, authorities have attempted to perform DNA tests on some items known to have been handled by the Zodiac Killer, such as the stamps from the letters he sent. Unfortunately, since the evidence was poorly collected and has since degraded, investigators haven't yet been able to build a complete DNA profile from collected materials. However, testing is continuing. Also hampering the investigations was the fact that serial killers were poorly understood during the late 1960s. The FBI was just beginning to study the behavior of serial killers and to profile them. Most police departments simply were not experienced with these types of crimes and had no set processes for working serial murders with unconnected victims that seemingly had little or no motive. Number 4. It's been hard to identify the Zodiac Killer because he had a fairly low victim count. In one of his letters to the media, the Zodiac Killer claimed to have murdered 37 victims. Officials can only confirm 7 victims, 4 men and 3 women, with 2 of the men surviving their attempted murders. In dispute are another 4 murders that were possibly committed by the Zodiac Killer and 1 more survivor. The low body count made it hard for police to establish patterns when it came to the killer. By comparison, other well-known serial killers such as Ted Bundy or the Green River Killer murdered upwards of 30 people. During the reign of the Zodiac Killer, the Manson family began their own spree, killing 8 people. The main reason why the Zodiac Killer has become so notorious is his cryptic, threatening, and taunting letters, many of which were printed in the local newspapers. Considering the similarity of the crimes, the police might have eventually linked the first 2 attacks together, the murder of the couples in Benicia and Vallejo. But the MO for the stabbings of the 3rd attack and the 4th, the shooting of the cabbie, don't fit. Until the Zodiac Killer taunted the police about the crime, SFPD was investigating the cabbie's murder as a robbery gone wrong. Without the Zodiac Killer announcing his murders, linking them, and threatening future crimes, the murders have just been sad blips in police records. Number 5. Intertwined with the low body count making it hard to notice patterns and identify the Zodiac Killer is the killer's MO or modus operandi. Serial killers tend to use the same method to murder each time, refining their techniques based on previous crimes. Also, they tend to pick the same type of victims. The Zodiac Killer both stabbed and shot his victims and preyed on couples and a single person. In his letters, the killer threatened to blow up various locations and even included instructions for making a bomb, showing that he was well acquainted with how explosives worked. Usually, the method of killing is very personal to the serial killer, and while they alter it as needed, they rarely switch it to an altogether different method of murder. Once again, the police wouldn't have connected the murder of the cabbie with the Zodiac Killer if he hadn't made a taunting confession in one of his letters. The Zodiac Killer seems to defy the typical classifications the FBI has created for killers. In fact, he would be categorized as a mixed killer. He displays both traits of serial and spree killers, as well as both organized and disorganized offenders, which brings us to the next reason why the Zodiac Killer was never identified. Number 6. The Zodiac Killer may have been more than one person. There have been many different theories as to the identity of the Zodiac Killer over the years. The Unabomber Ted Kaczynski was even bandied about as a suspect for a while, The police only publicly named a single suspect, Arthur Leigh Allen, a Vallejo, California school teacher who was institutionalized in 1975 for child molestation. Allen died in 1992 and in 2002 was exonerated when a relative of his provided a DNA sample to test against possible Zodiac killer DNA found on a stamp. There is definitely a camp of investigators that believe the Zodiac killer is multiple people. They point to the unusual mixed serial killer traits, the changing MO, and the intricate pictograms as proof that more than a single person was involved. Number 7. The Zodiac killer has managed to evade capture because he was simply lucky. The Zodiac killer committed his murders publicly, and yet hardly anyone saw anything. When he shot the cabbie, he actually briefly lingered at the scene and was seen by some local teens. In the poor light of a dim fall evening, they weren't able to get a good look at him. Likewise, it was from pure luck that the police operator misidentified his description. Also, while walking away from the scene of that shooting, the Zodiac killer just happened to turn in a direction away from the officers arriving at the scene. If he had gone the other way, he would have met them head-on. During the stabbing at Lake Berryessa, the killer had a prolonged interaction with his victims. First, he tied them up, then stabbed them, and then finally rode on their car. The length of time spent at the crime scene increased the possibility of a third party showing up, but no one did. It's not known whether the Zodiac killer purposely spread his crimes across multiple jurisdictions, but even he couldn't have foreseen how different agencies would have failed to close ranks and communicate poorly. Number 8. The final reason why the Zodiac killer was never caught was because he abruptly stopped killing. A hallmark of serial killers is their compulsion to murder. Rarely do serial offenders voluntarily cease killing sprees. Usually serial killers stop because they're caught and institutionalized in a prison or an asylum. It's possible the Zodiac killer might have stopped because he died. Some think he moved away from the Bay Area and continued to kill in another location. Or he may have continued to kill in the Bay Area but for reasons unknown kept silent about his crimes. In the early 1970s, a few unsolved murders happened in Santa Rosa, California, which some point to the Zodiac killer for. Others believe that the Zodiac killer quit because they were caught and jailed just for a different crime. Some think that the Zodiac killer completed his mission and that's why he stopped murdering. His real objective wasn't murder, but to make society pay attention to him. He succeeded at that, perhaps even beyond his wildest dreams. Some 40 years later, the Zodiac killer has become an American legend, our Jack the Ripper. Countless internet groups are devoted to him. The police ended up diverting a significant amount of resources arrayed against him to chase obscure leads in an attempt to solve his puzzles. He inspired and spawned at least 2 other serial killers that we know of, perhaps more. He's inspired several movies, fiction and documentaries, books, and even songs. Even now, the case has been reopened. The police convinced that in their files is a clue that just has to be found to crack the case wide open and reveal the identity of one of America's most infamous serial killers. I like killing people because it's so much fun. Those were the words embedded in a coded message sent by the Zodiac in July of 1969. The letter was sent to the newspaper editors at the San Francisco Examiner. This would not be the last encoded message with gruesome thoughts and details hidden within. The Zodiac is the most mysterious and elusive serial killer in United States history. You and I are about to gather clues, look at crime scenes, and analyze hidden messages to try and discover who the Zodiac really was. Let's delve deeper into the psyche of one of the most terrifying killers of all time. Over the years, more than 2,500 suspects have been put forth as the Zodiac killer. They range from Unabomber Ted Kaczynski to members of the Charles Manson family. In the 1990s, suspect number 1 was Arthur Leigh Allen. Allen was a Vallejo, California school teacher. It's clear that the Zodiac could be anyone from an already known killer to a school teacher. Our mission is to figure out where on this spectrum the real Zodiac killer might lie. There are 2 suspects who have not been completely ruled out thus far, and a third that's been recently accused of being the Zodiac. As investigators, we'll look into the evidence and try to come to our own conclusions. The first suspect we'll analyze is Lawrence Gein. The Zodiac clearly had an understanding of coding. He also had an affinity for naval gear, such as combat boots and firearms. Gein served in the Naval Reserves, where he would have learned coding and had access to the basic naval gear that the Zodiac used. In 1962, Lawrence Gein was in a car accident that resulted in a serious brain injury. This injury may have altered his ability to control urges. It could have led to a personality disorder through unbalanced chemicals and hormones in the brain. We know that the Zodiac struggled with internal conflict. He reached out for help in several of his letters, even stating that he could not control his urges to kill. It's been claimed by some, including a retired police detective, that Gein's name appears in one of the Zodiac ciphers. The Zodiac did write that he had embedded his name in the ciphers. He taunted the authorities, saying that if his code was cracked, they would know who he was. Could Gein have put his name in one of the ciphers because he was the Zodiac? Or was it a coincidence? Perhaps it was just a mistake by the retired detective when trying to break the code. This evidence does not seem to hold up for our investigation. Another connection between Gein and the Zodiac is through the murder of Darlene Ferrin. Let's take a closer look into this connection and the crime scene left behind. On July 4, 1969 in Vallejo, California, a 22-year-old mother named Darlene Ferrin and her friend Michael McGough were murdered by the Zodiac. They stopped at Blue Rock Springs Park to enjoy Independence Day. When interviewed after the attack, Michael said that a vehicle pulled into the lot they were parked in around midnight. The driver got out and fired a 9mm handgun at the car. Michael was shot in the jaw, shoulder, and leg but lived to tell the story. Darlene was hit several times and passed away on the ride to the hospital. At 12:40, the police received a call from a gas station payphone. The voice on the other line took responsibility for the shooting. The voice of the monster on the other line said, "I want to report a murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you'll find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." The bluntness of the call was the most unsettling part. It was after this confession that the first of the Zodiac letters were received by the newspapers in California. The first set of letters were postmarked on July 31, 1969. 3 different envelopes were sent to 3 different newspapers. The writer claimed responsibility for 2 shootings and provided grotesque details about the victims, weapons, and number of shots fired. The writer also included 1/3 of a cipher in the letters and demanded publication. The Zodiac threatened to kill again if newspapers did not publish the cipher and included the words, "I like killing people because it's so much fun." This was the first cipher the Zodiac created and it was his longest. The cipher was 408 characters long and it was laid out in a 24x17 grid. When police investigated the death of Darlene Ferrin, her sister identified Gein as a man who would bother Darlene at the restaurant where she worked. Darlene's sister only identified Gein from a photograph, but if there was a connection between one of the Zodiac's victims and Gein, that would be something we should take into consideration. Lawrence Gein was also identified as having the closest likeness to the Zodiac by a San Francisco police officer who unknowingly saw the Zodiac moments after the murder of a cab driver named Paul Stine. Paul Stine was murdered by the Zodiac on October 11, 1969. Stine picked up a man thinking it would be a routine cab ride, but he was dead wrong. On his way to the destination, the Zodiac shot him in the head and cut off a piece of his shirt. The Zodiac walked away from the scene of the crime just as police arrived. The cops were mistakenly looking for a black man as the suspect. They ignored the white man resembling the correct description. Racial profiling was common at this time in U.S. history. This murder was where the most famous sketch of the Zodiac Killer came from. The case was considered just a routine robbery until the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter from the Zodiac. The letter began, "I am the murderer of the taxi driver." The envelope contained a blood-stained piece of Paul Stine's shirt. There could be no denying the Zodiac was responsible. In the letter, the Zodiac mocked the police for failing to catch him and threatened to shoot children on a school bus. On November 8th and 9th, the Zodiac sent 2 more letters, the latter being the longest message he wrote and claiming that police had stopped him near the crime scene but let him go. This letter also included a recipe to make a bomb and a detailed diagram of the explosive. It was clear that the Zodiac had the technical know-how to make the device and was not afraid to use it. Perhaps Lawrence Gein learned basic engineering skills in the Navy to allow him to construct the bomb the Zodiac described. The following month, a letter addressed to famous attorney Melvin Belli was received. In it, we get a look at the psyche of the Zodiac. Its writer stated he was afraid that he would kill again. The Zodiac asked Belli to help, as if he were fighting a battle within himself. One side of his personality wanted to stop the mayhem. The other personality, the one clearly in control, only wanted to kill more. The Zodiac ended the note with, "Please help me. I cannot remain in control for much longer." These personality shifts could be due to brain trauma similar to what Lawrence Gein succumbed to in his car crash. For right now, though, the connections between Gein and the Zodiac are superficial and more evidence is needed. It's time to turn our investigation to another man who was suspected of being the Zodiac Killer. His name was Ross Sullivan. Several physical features of Sullivan are reminiscent of the Zodiac. He sported a crew cut and glasses similar to the man in a police sketch from the Stine murder. He also wore army jackets and military-style boots like those that left footprints at the Lake Berryessa stabbing. Let's delve further into the Zodiac murder of September 27, 1969 to see if we can uncover more clues. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing on the sandy shore of Lake Berryessa, just north of Napa, California. A hooded man with a white crossed circle stitched over his chest snuck up and held them at gunpoint. He bound their wrists and once they were secured, plunged a hunting knife into Hartnell's back 6 times. The Zodiac then stabbed Shepard 10 times. To complete the crime, the Zodiac walked over to Brian Hartnell's car and used a pen to draw a crossed circle on the door. He then wrote the dates and locations of the previous attacks. He called the Napa police and reported this horrific double murder. Among the evidence that was uncovered at the scene were military boot prints. However, there's no direct link to Sullivan in this case except his similar attire. But Ross Sullivan is connected to a different Zodiac murder in a much more concrete way. On October 30th, 1966, Sherry Josephine Bates left a note for her father, saying she'd gone to the library at City College in Riverside. The next morning, her Volkswagen Beetle was found abandoned in the library parking lot. Her body lay in an alley nearby, between 2 unoccupied houses. She'd been stabbed numerous times and her throat was slashed. It was a bloody scene. Police found a Timex watch and prints of military boots at the crime scene. Nothing had been stolen and no sexual assault had been conducted. The next month, a local newspaper received a typed letter titled The Confession. The murderer wrote, "Miss Bates was stupid. She went to the slaughter like a lamb. I'm not sick, I'm insane." These words made the authorities shudder. They were dealing with a man who had lost touch with reality. At first, it was unclear if this was a Zodiac killing. In April of that year, the police received another letter stating that Bates had to die. There will be more. The letter was signed with a symbol resembling the letter Z. Could the Z stand for Zodiac? Detectives later determined that the Zodiac was to blame for the murder due to similarities between Bates's murder and his other killings. Then, the smoking gun arrived in a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. The Zodiac confirmed the authorities' theory that he had murdered Bates. The letter stated, "I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they're only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there." A scary notion for the police to grapple with. But what does Sullivan have to do with this murder? Well, Ross Sullivan worked at the Riverside City College library, where Bates had gone to study and near where the body was found. Co-workers said that Ross Sullivan had made them uncomfortable and disappeared for several days after the murder. Again, this is not conclusive evidence, but it does link Sullivan to one of the earlier Zodiac killings. Ross Sullivan also had mental health problems. Although we're now more aware of the role mental health plays in someone's actions, in the 1960s less research on the topic was available. In 1967, Sullivan was hospitalized several times for bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. These mental health diseases may have caused the dark personality of the Zodiac to manifest itself with or without the knowledge of Ross Sullivan. It would seem that Sullivan has a clearer connection to the Zodiac murder than Lawrence Kane. Again, there is no conclusive evidence at this time, but Sullivan's actions do seem suspicious. A more recent claim for who the Zodiac killer was comes from a man named Gary Stewart. Stewart believes that his father was the Zodiac. It isn't every day that a son implicates his father of being a notorious serial killer. In 2014, Gary Stewart published his book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, and in his book he outlined evidence as to why he believes his father was the notorious Zodiac. Stewart grew up without knowing his father. His mother, Jude Guilford, was a 14-year-old fugitive married to her 27-year-old husband, Earl Van Best Jr. After Stewart was born, his father decided he had no interest in parental responsibility. He left his newborn son in a Louisiana apartment complex stairwell. If nothing else, Van Best was a terrible father. Upon being arrested for multiple crimes and negligence, Van Best ended up in a California state mental hospital. Jude Guilford put Stewart up for adoption at the time. It wasn't until Gary Stewart was a grown man that he had connected his father to the Zodiac. He first started making the connections when he was watching late-night TV. On the screen was the police sketch of the Zodiac. Stewart instantly recognized the close resemblance to a picture of his father and the Zodiac drawing. Gary Stewart claims that not only were his father and the Zodiac similar in their looks, but in their interests as well. He states that his father was interested in ciphers. He also mentions that Van Best had a deep connection to the Mikado. The Zodiac quoted the Arthur Sullivan opera in his letters. Maybe Van Best and the Zodiac shared the same love for this opera because they were the same person. Gary Stewart also claims that his father was in the right place at the right time. Van Best lived right around the corner from where the Zodiac hailed Paul Stein's cab and murdered him in 1969. These connections are circumstantial at best, and no definitive evidence connects Van Best to being the Zodiac. Later in his research, Stewart begins to become more conspiracy-oriented. He claims that since his mother eventually married a San Francisco detective named Rotea Guilford, that the police are covering up Van Best's identity. This seems far-fetched, but Stewart says it may have been to protect Rhoda Guilford from being associated with the Zodiac's first wife. Stewart believes that there is one piece of evidence that proves without a doubt his father was the Zodiac. In one of the Zodiac's most intricate ciphers, the word best appears. This could be a coincidence or the cipher being read wrong, but to Stewart, it is the smoking gun that his father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac. However, experts and law enforcement officers are less convinced, and the case of the Zodiac killer still remains open and unsolved. It would seem there is just not enough evidence for us to make a definitive identification at this time. Something that keeps detectives and us at the infographic show up at night is, did the Zodiac ever stop? Or did he just take a break and change his MO? After his last letter on March 22, 1971, there was radio silence from the Zodiac for almost 3 years. It wasn't until 1974 that he resurfaced again. The San Francisco Chronicle received a letter on January 29, 1974 from the Zodiac. In it was a nightmare come to life. The Zodiac alluded to more murders in his note, which read, Me 37, SFPD 0. This has been interpreted as the Zodiac taking responsibility for 37 deaths and the San Francisco Police Department arresting him 0 times. Since 1974, no one has heard from the Zodiac. But this does not mean he was not or is not still out there. What happened? Where did the Zodiac go? Why did he stop killing, or at least stop claiming his murders? According to the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, serial killers may stop murdering others if something significant changes in their life. One theory as to why the Zodiac stopped is that the police were coming too close to catching him. This may have scared him into changing his ways. However, this does not seem likely as he constantly mocked the police for not catching him. Another possibility is that the attention he was receiving from his letters and ciphers were a substitute for killing. Or it could have been something as simple as growing older and less able to carry out his murderous desires. Some psychologists have hypothesized that the Zodiac may have recovered from an identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. As he recovered, he could have lost the urge to kill, or perhaps he was institutionalized and we just don't know about it. Yet the scariest theory of all is that he just kept killing and never took responsibility for it. He even later said in a letter postmarked November 12, 1969, I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my murders. They shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, a few fake accidents, etc. It's impossible to tell if he kept good on this promise unless we find out who the Zodiac was. If nothing else, the Zodiac is still the stuff nightmares are made of. We know of at least 5 confirmed murders he committed, but it is possible he had 37 or more victims. Some of his ciphers still have not been cracked and may hold clues to his identity. The Zodiac killer case is still an open and ongoing investigation. As of yet, there is no definitive answer to who the Zodiac was or if he is still out there. A young woman walks down an alleyway on her way home from college, illuminated only in small puddles of light by the lamps above her. Little does she know that a man will be waiting for her as she emerges into the car park. Poor soul, she thinks after seeing that well-dressed man is struggling to carry books to his Volkswagen Beetle, especially as one of his arms is in a sling. She walks over to him and offers assistance, to which the polite and softly spoken man gives her his utmost thanks. As she takes some of the books and leans down to place them in the passenger seat, he hits her over the head with a tire iron. He gets into the driver's seat and leaves the scene. He'll strangle her like he did many others. He'll do unspeakable things to her. He is the quintessential maniac. His name is Ted Bundy. The scene we've just described to you was the modus operandi of this particular serial killer. Well, when he had planned his murders. Bundy's thing was to use his good looks, his speaking skills, and his educated demeanor to lure people into his trap. At times, he'd put his arm in a sling or even walk on crutches to give his victims a false sense of security. How harmful could a man be on crutches, one dressed in a suit, driving a cute car? This is why he was so hard to catch. He just didn't fit the profile of a serial killer, one who did absolutely disgusting things to people at the moment they died and after they died. He probably should have been caught much earlier than he was. After all, when young women went out and never came back, on a few occasions witnesses came forward and said they had seen a man lurking around, a man with one arm in a sling, a man that drove a VW Bug. 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball was last seen talking to a guy in a car park who had brown hair and an arm in a sling. Soon after, Susan Elaine Rancourt went missing, never to return. 2 people came forward after that and said they'd been approached by a man who wore a sling. He'd asked them for help putting some books into his car, a VW Beetle. Then, on June 11, 1974, University of Washington student Georgianne Hawkins went missing. Her body would never be found. We know that she'd been with her boyfriend and she left him after midnight. On her walk home to her sorority house, she was spotted by a male friend who was driving a car. He shouted out of the window, "Hey George, what's happening?" She chatted with him for a minute or two and expressed that she was a bit nervous about her upcoming Spanish exam. Later, witnesses told the cops that they'd seen some guy skulking around in an alleyway close to Hawkins's, a guy whose arm was in a sling. One woman said he'd asked her to help him load a briefcase into a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. Little did she know at the time how close she was to being murdered. Hawkins wasn't so lucky. She fell for the trick, as any helpful person might. We know what happened to her because Bundy later talked about it. When she was close enough to his car, he hit her over the head with a crowbar, which knocked her clean out. When she came around, she was obviously confused, although to Bundy's surprise, she seemed to think that he'd turned up to help her with Spanish. She was evidently in shock. This is what Bundy said about that. It's odd the kinds of things people will say under those circumstances. He strangled her and dumped her body, a body he would return to on at least 3 occasions. You can only imagine how demented he was returning to a body that was decomposing. He had his reasons, but we'll get to that. Bundy was brazen, there's no doubt about it. He didn't ever think he'd be caught. He thought he was too intelligent for the police. After all, he'd worked in politics. He worked as an assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he wrote a paper on rape prevention. He did a stint at the Department of Emergency Services, where he talked about missing women and how to find them. And that's likely why Bundy didn't have any qualms about returning to the alleyway from where he'd picked up Hawkins. The day after the abduction, he was there at the same time as the police, hiding in plain sight as he picked up one of the girl's shoes and her necklace. If he wasn't picking up girls in a car park or close by one, he was sneaking into basements while they slept and then bludgeoning the victim with some kind of iron bar. Bundy was like the boogeyman, a serial killer that crawled through windows and viciously attacked people while they were at their most vulnerable. But he was also a con artist. He played confidence tricks and he was very good at it. Investigators knew that when girls went missing, at times a man was seen with an arm in a sling, a man that owned a VW Beetle. Surely Bundy was easy prey after that. How many VW Beetles were there in those areas when the abduction happened? Areas dotted around the Pacific Northwest. The reality was Bundy's reign of terror was only in the early stages. The public and police were worried, that's for sure. Young folks stopped hitching rides, and many became fearful of talking to strangers or leaving their windows open at night. Those with most to fear were young white women. Bundy's victims were almost always in their late teens or early 20s. They were Caucasian, and most of them were attractive. They studied at university and were said to be intelligent and gifted students. Another thing was the fact that each girl disappeared at a college where construction work was going on. Could the disappearances be linked, wondered investigators? They just didn't know. They had very little forensic evidence to work with, and there were no bodies. That didn't mean the cops thought the girls had just taken off someplace. Nothing about their personalities and state of mind suggested that. Only weeks after Hawkins went missing, 2 women were abducted in broad daylight at Lake Sammamish State Park, not far from the city of Seattle. Bundy had first approached 5 women in the park, and in what they later described as a Canadian or British accent, the man introduced himself as Ted. Ted, dressed in a pressed white tennis outfit with one arm in a sling, politely asked them if they could help him unload a sailboat from his bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 4 of them said no, but one followed him to his car. Thankfully, she ran away when she became aware that there was no sailboat. That day, Bundy managed to enlist one woman for help, and he later abducted another close to a restroom. Both would die. Did he kill one in front of the other? He once said that that was true, but close to his execution date, he recanted that terribly bleak detail. This is not a story about his crimes, though. What we want to know is how the hell did the police not get closer to Bundy, seeing as he was using the same car and the same sling trick, and so the same modus operandi? He even told the girls that escaped that he was named Ted. What more did the cops need? A written confession? They were closer, but still a long way from getting him. They at least now had good description of this Ted guy, and it did quite look like him. In no time at all, this sketch appeared in many newspapers and was shown on TV. Remember that we said Bundy worked at the Department of Emergency Services? Well, one of his co-workers there saw the sketch and heard about the Volkswagen Beetle, and she knew she was looking at her colleague, Mr. Bundy. She made a call to the cops, as did another person that knew Ted Bundy. The cops at the time were receiving something like 200 of these calls in one day, and they quickly assumed that a clean-cut law student with no criminal record couldn't be behind the abductions. Serial killers didn't look like that, or so they thought. The heat was on though, and Bundy knew it. A couple of months after his last murder, bones were being found. Those bones were the remains of his victims, scattered in various places where the cops hadn't thought to look. It was fortunate for Bundy then that he was accepted to study at the University of Utah Law School. He packed his bags and headed south in August of '74. He was only in Utah a month when he started killing again. September 2nd, a hitchhiker. October 2nd, a 16-year-old girl. October 18th, a 17-year-old girl from a pizza parlor. It turned out that she was the daughter of a police chief. After her decomposing body was found on a hiking trail, the post-mortem exam revealed that Bundy had kept her alive for perhaps 7 days. Each had been subjected to the most brutal depravity, although Bundy admitted years later that after he killed them, he shampooed their hair and applied makeup to their faces, keeping them in a state that he liked. He wanted the physical possession of the remains, and he wanted to do what he wanted to them. He sometimes chopped them, sometimes kept heads in his apartment, and he dressed them in the way he wanted them to look. And then he took a photograph. When you work hard to do something right, he once said, you don't want to forget it. More abductions happened, more murders, as well as attempted abductions. The disappearances were reported in the media, and after reading about them, a woman named Elizabeth Klepfer, who dated Bundy back when he was in Washington, put 2 and 2 together. She not only called the King County cops and told them that she thought she had been dating the killer, but she also told the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and said the same. She was still talking to Bundy at this point on the telephone, but she didn't say anything about her calls. For her, the sketch looked like Ted Bundy. The car was Bundy's, and so the murders following him around were just too much of a coincidence. Bundy started then killing in Colorado. Things didn't change much. Death by blunt force trauma, sometimes strangulation, bodies dumped, mutilated, sometimes wearing clothes that weren't theirs. 1975 drew to an end and there were more victims, some whose bodies have never been found. 76 turned out to be another bloody year, so how come Washington cops weren't at the very least looking at Bundy? They only did that after they discovered a new toy, a computer and a database. They found that they could input data about the murders and the computer would compare that data to data already in the system. Thousands of names were in that database, but only 26 names matched the crimes. Bundy's was one of them. The problem was connecting the Utah and Colorado murders to the Pacific Northwest murders. At the time, there were no large databases containing all the state's police departments. The fact of the matter was, while the cops should have known better after the tip-offs, because Bundy moved around, he managed to evade capture. But then, he was pulled over by a cop in a Salt Lake City suburb after he'd been driving around looking suspicious. On searching Bundy's car, the cop found quite the collection of suspicious items: a ski mask, trash bags, handcuffs, a crowbar, lengths of rope, and an ice pick. All that was pretty much the consummate serial killer's stash. It didn't take long for the cops to understand that they might have a maniac on their hands, and they had the phone call from Bundy's lover in their records, and they had his car description from one of the abductions. Still, after searching his house, the police didn't have enough to keep him. One thing they didn't find that day was a bunch of photographs of his dead victims. Things would have been very different had they discovered those awful snaps. Bundy was on the loose again, but he was being monitored all day long. Some of the cops flew to Seattle to speak to Bundy's lover. She told him that some things just didn't add up, such as why did he keep crutches in his house? And what about that plaster of Paris? Not to mention the surgical gloves, big knives, meat cleaver, and a bag full of women's clothes. Bundy was certainly in a fix now, but he was by no means done. He sold his beloved Beetle, but that was soon sequestered by investigators who gave the interior a good going over. What they found were strands of hair from females, and those females were very likely victims of murder. Police brought Bundy in and put him in a lineup, but they only had enough evidence to possibly put him on trial for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. His parents paid his $15,000 bail and off he went, once again, a free man, but under heavy round-the-clock surveillance. He actually lived with his lover again while he was on bail, which should have been a very strange time for her. At this point, the lead investigators from Utah, Washington, and Colorado all finally got together and shared their stories and what evidence they had. They were pretty darn sure that they had a serial killer on their hands, and an utterly depraved one at that. Before they could get him for murder, though, he faced trial for kidnapping and assault. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. While in there, he was charged with just one of the murders. Bundy was a desperate man around this time, likely knowing that his crimes or most of them would catch up with him and he'd be looking at the death penalty. He chose to defend himself, and because of that, he didn't have to wear handcuffs or leg shackles in court. On one of those court appearances, he managed to convince the court he needed the library and he leapt from a window. He actually survived for 6 days around the wilderness of the Aspen Mountains, but was eventually picked up by the cops. The case against him for that one murder was actually quite weak, but it seemed that Bundy believed they would get him. If he was done for that case, more cases might follow. Over a period of 6 months, he got his hands on a floor plan of the jail. He saved money after getting it smuggled in by visitors, and he also got himself a hacksaw. On December 30th, 1977, Bundy filled his bed with books, so it might look like he was sleeping. He then got through the ceiling and into an apartment. There, he changed into civilian clothes and then he walked out of the jail. He went from Chicago to Atlanta to Florida in stolen cars, only stopping to steal certain items or wallets from people. On January 15, 1978, he walked around at night in Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he assaulted, bludgeoned, strangled, and bit 3 sleeping women in 3 different rooms, all within about 15 minutes. 2 of them survived but were very badly injured. He left the sorority house and went to an apartment building where he viciously attacked another girl, fracturing her skull and jaw. There, he left behind one of his favorite things, his pantyhose mask. Police also found sperm and hair samples. Bundy later drove to Jacksonville where he abducted and killed a 12-year-old girl. A few days later, he was stopped by a police officer. During questioning, he kicked the man's legs and ran for it. The cop fired warning shots, but Bundy kept running. He was too slow, he was tackled, and in spite of his best efforts, he couldn't get the gun from the cop. Bundy was done for, sat in a car, handcuffed, on his way to certain death. Still, this Florida policeman didn't know who he had in the car. He was not aware that he was carrying one of the USA's most wanted fugitives. He certainly had no idea that the occupant of his vehicle would become known as one of the worst, most vile serial killers of all time. A demon whose warped brutality knew no bounds. And do you know what Bundy said to the cop while he was in the car? He said, "I wish you had killed me." Eventually, he confessed to 30 murders, but there could have been many more. On January 24, 1989, age 42, Bundy took his final breaths in the electric chair. His last words were, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." They said he was a pillar of the community. Friendly neighbors watched from their windows as he shoveled snow for the elderly. He became Pogo the Clown for the local children, who guffawed at his tricks and happily received a balloon for being such a good boy or girl. A close friend to politicians and professionals, when the mask finally was removed from this sadistic killer, society was shaken to its very core. John Wayne Gacy was a man who said in custody, "I've taken 3.5 hours of truth serum, sodium amytal, the maximum amount I could have. It shows I have no knowledge of the crime whatsoever." That's strange because his crimes were certainly memorable. When Gacy was not making kids laugh at tricks, he did one-on-one shows in his house that involved asking a young man to wear a pair of handcuffs to try to get out of them. Having already seen that Gacy was a respectable member of the local community, the victim gladly slipped his hands into the cuffs. His captor would then fasten a noose around his neck, pulling it tighter in increments. This was about the time when the victim knew there was no trick, and Gacy was certainly no pillar of the community. But let's go back to the start. Like many serial killers in the making, the young Gacy suffered a troubled upbringing. He stuffed his trauma down into the far reaches of his brain, but it wouldn't be long before his horrifying past resurfaced in new ways when he grew up. Gacy was an outcast as a young boy and had a father who was quick to reprimand the youngster. Gacy was powerless. This doesn't often bode well for the adult in the making. But at the age of 18, it looked as though Gacy was doing all right. That's when he became the assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party politician. It seemed like young Gacy was becoming a respectable young man. Still, he could never do any good in his father's eyes. His pop, an ugly human if there ever was one, was often calling his son sissy boy and other similar slurs. John Wayne Gacy was homosexual, but you can understand why he tried his hardest to repress his sexual urges and feelings with a father like that. A leading detective on the case will say Gacy was actually a homophobic homosexual, his denial being so strong. Gacy moved away from his father and ended up working as a mortuary assistant in Las Vegas. There he took perhaps a too keen interest in the embalming of bodies. One day he got into a coffin of a recently deceased man. He hugged the body, he stroked the slick embalmed skin. For those few moments he didn't feel powerless at all. He then jumped out of the coffin in a state of shock. With actual living young men becoming intimate posed more problems. Even though Gacy got married, it was just a charade. When he became a manager at a KFC outlet, he'd often invite young male workers back to his house to play pool and drink alcohol. He'd usually come on to them, and when they pushed him away, he'd just say he was kidding. The guys usually weren't gay, and even if they were, Gacy was hardly attractive. His solution to those unreciprocated advances was simple and vile. Abduct them first, torture them, and kill them. He did this many times, and it seems he did so without so much as stirring anyone's curiosity. He was, after all, a community leader, an organizer of parades, a successful businessman and fundraiser whose mask remained tight against his doughy face. He was, as people later said, the devil in disguise. But let's be frank here, viewers. Had any of you more discerning people known Gacy back then and really talked to him, you'd have known he was screwy in about 20 minutes. If you'd hung around him for a few weeks, you'd likely have seen his massive stash of pornography. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but you'd have to notice that he spent as much time hanging out with guys in their late teens as he did with his wife and children. You'd then have found out that he had two clown characters, Pogo, the nice clown, and Patches, the sometimes devilish clown. You wouldn't have had to read Sigmund Freud to figure out that this was a two-sided man. Sometimes he'd keep the clown outfit on, and you'd later see him collapsed over a beer in a local bar. Had you not come to the conclusion by then that Mr. Gacy might have been hiding something perhaps a little dark, your intuitive faculties were as dull as a potato's. But you didn't even need heightened intuition to see what he was like. He sexually harassed a number of his staff, all young men. He once told one of them, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you, and how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" You might have even seen how young men went into his house and never came out. You could have talked with a young man who Gacy tried to handcuff, likely with the intent to kill, only to be out-wrestled. Gacy told that guy, "Not only are you the only one who got out of the cuffs, you got them on me." There were other survivors too. If you were a young guy back then living anywhere near that neighborhood, you would have heard of Mr. Gacy, the creepy clown who couldn't keep his hands to himself. If you'd been able to look deeper, you would have seen he served time in prison for assault on a young man. So this begs the question, how come he wasn't investigated? It was partly because people back then, even the police, didn't expect serial killers to look from the outside as upstanding members of the community. Gacy wasn't just a pillar of the community, he was the lodestone, especially once he'd gotten his painting, decorating, and maintenance business off the ground. His political work even got him a photograph with the First Lady Rosalind Carter. If there was a serial killing university degree, the first thing you learn in evasion tactics class is that if you want to become a prime wolf, you first have to know how to perfect playing the lamb. It also helps to earn money, since money and power afford a killer cloaking device. Ask the United States Secret Service, which gave Gacy special clearance. Okay, let's now get down to the business of how he was finally caught. On December 11, 1978, a woman named Elizabeth Peist went to the local drugstore to pick up her teenage son who worked there. She was in great spirits that day. It was her birthday, and she had invited all her friends to her party. The devoted son, Robert, had helped her get things ready for the party. Robert told his mom to wait in the parking lot. He said he just had to speak to a guy about a possible summer job, a job that paid a whole lot more than his drugstore gig. All Miss Peist was told was that the guy offering the job worked in construction. Robert had met him when the guy went to the drugstore to talk about possible maintenance. Elizabeth sat in the car, giddy about the party to come and glad her son was helping out with making sure everything went well. But then 20 minutes passed and he still hadn't come out of the store. She never saw him again. She couldn't enjoy the party that evening with her son still not having contacted her. Not even a phone call just to say he got waylaid. Later that night, when everyone had left, she called the police and reported Robert missing, informing them about the contractor he said he was meeting. The cops soon discovered that the contractor was 36-year-old John Wayne Gacy. This guy was known to almost everyone in the community. In 3 different cities, he'd been voted Man of the Year by the Junior Chamber of Commerce. He had a successful business and had even met the president's wife. When the cops looked more into the man, they found out he often visited the local hospital children's ward. There, playing Pogo the Clown to seriously ill kids, he bounced around doing tricks. One was handcuffing the kids and then pretending he'd lost the key and telling them they'd stay that way forever. Another was running around and tying them up with rope. The children couldn't get enough of it. When police interviewed his neighbors, they told him Gacy was a lovely guy, despite going through 2 divorces and not seeing his 2 kids much. Every Christmas, his house was always the one with the most Christmas lights. When it snowed, he never failed to go out in the street and shovel old folks' driveways. So police didn't immediately think, serial killing sadist. In fact, they might have left Gacy alone had he not denied going to the drugstore that day Robert went missing. Witnesses had put him there. This encouraged the cops to dig a little deeper. They only had to scrape the surface to find the part-time party clown had been imprisoned in the past for attacking a teenager. They also saw that similar charges had been dropped in another case that mirrored that one. What was just as shocking was a police report from 1978, which Gacy had invited a 28-year-old man to smoke some weed in his car. He told police at the time that Gacy knocked him out by putting a rag soaked in chloroform over his mouth. Gacy took him back to his house and assaulted him. Police didn't charge Gacy, and the matter was settled over a $3,000 payout. Now, a few months later, he'd been connected to a missing teen. Police had to investigate. Too many things just seemed wrong about Gacy. Police got a warrant and went to search his house. They found all kinds of books and films related to sex, a starting pistol, a length of nylon rope, drugs that can make someone sleepy, police badges, and if that wasn't suspicious enough, lots of IDs and underwear that did not belong to Gacy. In his bedroom was a giant clown painting. Close to that was a TV alarm clock and radio. unbeknownst to cops, something that had belonged to one of his victims. On closer inspection, police found their pièce de résistance, a drugstore receipt in a wastebasket that had at one point been in Robert Peist's pocket. They didn't know this just yet. Police also found a class of 1975 Maine West High School ring. On it was the initials JAS. They didn't know it at the time, but the ring belonged to one of Gacy's former employees, John Allen Syke, who became a victim himself. They surveilled his house after that and followed him everywhere he went. Gacy seemed to enjoy this at first, going over to the police car outside his house and telling the cops where he was about to go. As time went on, he said the police were harassing him for no good reason, all the time trying to prove how important he was. One time, detectives went to lunch with Gacy. They asked him about his clown thing. Gacy said he loved being pogo. Being a clown, he said, meant you could go out in public and grab women, and all they did was laugh about it. He told them being a clown, you can get away with murder. Police then interviewed one of his former employees, who told him Gacy once asked him to spread lime in a crawl space under his house. That's when they started working on getting a second search warrant. One day, Gacy lost his temper and went out to the surveillance vehicle. He said to the cops, "Come inside, have a coffee, look around, there's nothing to see." Meanwhile, the neighbors wondered why those horrible cops were harassing poor Mr. Gacy. In the house, one of the cops noticed something when he flushed the toilet. It wasn't physical, it was a smell every detective knows well: death. That second warrant couldn't come soon enough. Soon after, Gacy turned up at his lawyer's office looking rattled and drunk. He told his lawyers he had something to say. When they asked what, he pulled out the newspaper, pointing at the article about the missing boy Robert Peist. Gacy said, "The boy's dead. He's dead. He's in a river." Through the night, the drunk Gacy said he'd been the jury, judge, and executioner of many, many people. He said some were under the house and others were in the river, although Gacy was worse for wear throughout his rambling. He wasn't under arrest at this point and so left, now badly hungover. He wouldn't remain a free man long, but while he was, he drove over to meet a friend and said, "I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few." On December 21st, police got the second warrant to search his house. As they looked around, they found a kind of trap door. That led to a crawl space, so one of the detectives got in and started crawling along the tunnel. His nostrils were immediately filled with the stench of decomposition. He shouted up to the other detectives, "I think this place is full of kids." At first, police found 3 bodies, all in various stages of rot. They also found bits of bodies. What they were looking at was perhaps one of the USA's worst serial killers. Turned out Gacy had been killing for a while, even when he was living with his second wife. Once she was out of the house, he lured young men back to his place on the promise of booze and weed. He'd often play his clown game with them, strapping handcuffs over their wrists to see if they could get out. They'd become worried, and then he would strangle them. He usually did this slowly, first by putting the rope around their neck and telling them it too was a game. He gradually fastened it tighter and tighter by twisting a stick until they could hardly breathe. He tortured some of his victims while they were in this state of terminal distress. His wife would often complain about the horrid smell, to which Gacy would always blame dead rats. When she complained too much, he told her to mind her own business. She asked about all the clothes and wallets she found, seemingly from the young men. Again, Gacy told her not to pry into his personal business. That's when she left. Police interviewed survivors, mostly poor kids and prostitutes he found on the streets. Although Gacy was open to picking up any kind of hitchhiker, he'd take them back to his house and show them that photo of himself with the First Lady. This was usually enough to make the men feel safe. The only reason they survived was that they outright refused to play the handcuff game with him. They didn't tell the cops, for the sad fact that most of them saw police as the enemy. If they did take part in the trick, they died. Gacy told police that when he was tightening that rope around his victim's neck, for the final time he would often recite the 23rd Psalm. It starts with the line, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And later comes the unforgettable line, "Yea, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." God knows what might have been going through the minds of his victims. Gacy was doing most of the killing when he was the most famous for playing pogo, so he could have killed and entertained a bunch of sick kids or the children of his politician friends. As for why he did it, Gacy once told FBI profiler Robert Ressler that all his victims were just worthless little queers and punks. He later denied the murders, saying he'd been set up. In his many interviews, he said the media made him into some kind of monster. He said, "They've created this fantasy monster image, and it's been going on for the last 12 years, and I never had no comment. And I had no need to talk to the media for the simple reason that they were looking for sensationalism. They were looking for the monster." It wasn't exactly a cogent defense, seeing as a mass of bodies were found under his house and their belongings inside of his house. In a separate interview, Gacy said, "If you want to say I slept in the house of a dead body, okay, fine, I'll buy that. But in the same room? No. And besides, the dead won't bother you, it's the living you gotta worry about." He once created a document when in correspondence to the New Yorker. It was a Q&A which he answered himself. Here are some of the answers, just to give you more insight into how he either fooled himself or was an outright liar. My biggest regret: being so trusting and gullible, taken advantage of. Favorite song: Send in the Clowns, Amazing Grace. I consider myself liberal with values. Gacy told the interviewer he hadn't committed the murders. He said at one point, "I'll tell you what, I'm not gonna make no damn Ted Bundy's last-minute confessions." The interviewer didn't expect him to, nor did he believe much of what Gacy had said over many hours of chats. Gacy should have been caught much earlier, or at least should have set off a few lights in the radar of the local police departments. In 1975, an 18-year-old former employee of Gacy named John Butkovich had an argument with him over some missing pay. Butkovich went missing after that. Gacy was interviewed by the cops, but nothing came of it. Remember, this was a man with a very sketchy record of hurting young men. The boy's parents called the cops over 100 times, each time demanding that they investigate Gacy. They didn't. Gacy later told police that he got Butkovich stoned and drunk and then inveigled him to put the handcuffs on behind his back. Gacy said he sat on him for at least an hour before strangling him. He then had to rush to bury the body since his wife and kids said they were coming back. During the trial, the prosecutor said John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes, but one must tremble. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all. That is true. He could have gotten away with so many murders. Maybe it was his political connections and air of importance that helped him escape the eyes of the police. That and the fact that he was Man of the Year. There was also linkage blindness, meaning different police departments didn't or couldn't link up his earlier offenses. Still, maybe Gacy wasn't working alone. An investigator later said there was overwhelming evidence Gacy worked with an accomplice. He could have also been part of some depraved ring, which is what many people now think. There's fairly convincing evidence that he was involved with a man who operated such a ring. Gacy was convicted of 33 murders in all. On May 10, 1994, he received a lethal injection. He had no last words, although some dubious sources state he said, "Kiss my..." You need to fill in that final word yourself. Cursing offends some people.
If you've read or watched interviews with serial killers, most of them either come across as slightly deranged or at least very creepy. But the focus of today's show, we must admit, seems kinda likable in the interviews. Watch the one in 1994 where Jeff tells all while sat next to his loving father. "My childhood wasn't filled with any great tragedies," he told the interviewer, but then explained his predilection for dissecting dogs and cats as a kid. "It could have led to a normal hobby like taxidermy," he added, but it didn't. And soft-spoken Jeff turned his efforts towards killing and taking apart human beings in an unimaginable fashion. "I acted on my fantasies and that's where everything went wrong," he said. Today we'll see how wrong it went. In this episode of the Infographic Show, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster. If you've seen the recent movie about our killer, called My Friend Dahmer, you'll see he is portrayed as a bit of a loner in school with some strange habits. He has few friends, but he doesn't seem to have violent impulses. You'd probably not even notice him if you went to the same school. The movie was based on a graphic novel by the same name written by Durf Backdurf. He researched Dahmer, and this is what he had to say. "There are a surprising number out there who view Jeffrey Dahmer as some kind of anti-hero, a bullied kid who lashed back at the society that rejected him. This is nonsense. Dahmer was a twisted wretch whose depravity was almost beyond comprehension." So, how did this quiet boy become a twisted serial killer? Well, as you already know, Dahmer had a penchant for dissecting animals that he found on the road. After dissection, he would often dissolve the bodies in a barrel of chemicals. This was at his family home in Ohio. Dahmer has called this time of his life intense, stating that his mother was often frantic and his dad always busy. He got little attention at home, and this seems to have been a catalyst to his problems. Psychologists might say Jeff grew up with a dysphoric family, which kinda means a family mess. It's said at one point the young Dahmer had even tried to take his own life. He had a few buddies, and they would later tell the authorities, media, and book writers about how Jeff would find bugs and small animals and dissect them. Dahmer has admitted that he wanted to see how they fitted together. His dad said as a kid, his son fell in love with bones. He loved hearing the sound they made and spent much of his time looking for them. Yep, perhaps the busy father should have looked into this morbid fascination with dead bodies and their different parts. The writing was on the wall, but it said his dad, who was an analytical chemist, just thought Jeff had a curious mind. as all scientists should. But despite all his weirdness, he played tennis regularly and was in the school band for a while. He also turned up to school sometimes stinking of booze. He was a bit of a class clown, sometimes acting out seizures or pretending he had cerebral palsy. This became known as doing a Dahmer. This was when he was in his early teens. It's then that the real trouble started. Jeff realized that he was gay sometime around the age of 14. Due to the prevailing culture of the time, he had to keep that secret. He would sometimes watch a male jogger running down the road while he was hidden in the bushes. He fantasized about this guy, but he wasn't thinking about candlelit dinners and nights in front of the TV watching Happy Days. No, young Jeff jumped the shark, so to speak, and imagined somehow making this runner unconscious and then having sex with the lifeless body. He even once planned to actually go through with it, waiting in the bushes armed with a baseball bat, but the jogger didn't run that day. At age 17, with his parents still screaming at each other continually, his grades going downhill and his drinking getting worse, Dahmer was at the height of his unhappiness. He did graduate though, right at the time his parents divorced. It's right after graduation, a matter of a few weeks, that Dahmer graduated from dissecting animals to dissecting humans. At age 18, he picked up a guy, Stephen Mark Hicks, who was hitchhiking to a place called Lockwood Corners, Ohio, to see a concert. He was 18, the same age as Jeff, so it doesn't seem out of the ordinary that this young guy would agree to go back to Dahmer's pad and do some drinking. Only Jeff wasn't too happy when the guy called his own bell and said he should go. No, Jeff didn't like that at all. He knocked the kid out with a dumbbell and then finished him off by strangling him with the bar of the dumbbell. He then masturbated over the corpse. When that was done, he chopped up the body and put various parts in bags and buried them. Later, he would dig up the parts and slice the flesh from the bones. He then crushed those bones and scattered what was left in woodland like one would scatter the ashes of someone they loved. That was Jeff's first murder, and as we say, it's hard to believe the man in the interviews could sit in his house paring flesh from bones. From that date in 1978 until he was arrested in 1991, he would kill 17 people, so we can't detail every murder. What we will say is that Dahmer has few equals in the milieu of the total depravity. He didn't kill for a while as he enlisted in the army. That lasted from 1978 to 1981 as he was kicked out for his heavy drinking. At the time, the army didn't know, or chose not to believe, that Jeff was a rapist. He worked in the medic unit with a guy of similar age named Preston Davis. Davis believes Dahmer drugged him and raped him. He later told the press, "I was raped by Jeffrey. I am just thankful to be alive to tell the story." He was replaced by a 17-year-old named Billy Joe Capshaw, who bunked with Dahmer. Capshaw later told the press that Dahmer tied him up and raped him several times. "I was there for another 17 months with Jeff, being raped and tortured." Capshaw said he had even used a rape kit to prove it to his officers, but it seems the army didn't believe him. Once Dahmer is out of the army, what does he do next? During the years until his next murder, you could say he was still active regarding his devotion to being evil. He drugged young men and then had sex with their unconscious bodies. It's thought he did this around a dozen times. He also fantasized about digging up dead bodies and doing things to them. This of course was not convenient, and so Jeff was about to start making his own dead bodies. He waited until 1987 and then killed and dismembered another young man while living with his grandmother. Again, he masturbated over the corpse. He took it a step further though. Dahmer always said that he didn't mean to kill the first of those victims at his grand's place, and he just woke up with a bloody dead man in his bed. Nonetheless, he didn't exactly get on the phone to the cops and frantically explain that there had been a terrible accident. On the contrary, he chopped up the body, put the parts in a suitcase, and then boiled the flesh from the severed head in chemicals. When he had a shiny skull at the end of his cooking, he used that as a masturbation tool. After a while, he crushed that and scattered the bits. While staying with his grandmother, he killed again, employing a similar modus operandi of drugging, strangling, having some kind of intercourse with the corpse, dismembering the body, and keeping the skull after boiling. One lucky guy he brought home didn't get killed, only because his grand discovered that Jeff had company that evening. His grandmother quickly threw him out because he was a drunk, and because he brought young men home late at night, and because for some reason she smelled something foul emanating from Jeff's room. As you can imagine, when living in his own place, things got worse. He was actually arrested and later charged for drugging and sexually molesting a 13-year-old, and then arrested on a similar charge again, but prior to being sentenced, he killed again. This time he found a very handsome chap who was a male model. He met him in a gay bar, and even though Dahmer said he had not intended to kill that night, he felt he didn't have much choice as the model came and flirted with him. Again, after flaying the dead body and smashing up the bones, Dahmer got rid of what was left. Only this time, he kept the genitals and the head, fully preserving them in acetone. He said he did this just because the guy was so good looking. In 1989, he got 5 years probation for his sexual offense with children. This is when he went on a bit of a killing spree, almost always drugging young guys and making his unique kind of love to the corpse, then flaying the bodies or dissolving the parts in acid, and sometimes keeping the skulls. He was building a skull collection, something the cops would later find to their horror. He branched out, too, in terms of what he did to the bodies. Sometimes he would take photos of himself with the dead, you can see them online, and sometimes he would just keep the heads for a while and chat with them and kiss them. He would also take photos, sometimes at each stage of the dismembering process. But perhaps the pinnacle of Dahmer's weirdness was when, after drugging one young man, he decided not to kill him outright, but to drill a hole through his skull, pour in warm water, and so render the victim in a vegetative state. Then he could have a kind of living slave. Dahmer would always say later that all he wanted was company and for the men not to leave. However, his victim woke up and was not exactly vegetized, saying to Dahmer, "I have a headache. What time is it?" Apparently, it was time to die, as Dahmer gave him more spiked drink and strangled the man. He tried this again with a 14-year-old, only this time injecting hydrochloric acid into the young boy's skull, the frontal lobe to be exact. He then took the semi-conscious boy to his bedroom, where his previous victim's body was still laying. It said the boy saw the corpse but was too messed up to do anything. Dahmer left the boy alone at one point to go get some more beers, only to find on his return that the kid was out in the street talking to 3 women. They noticed the boy was bleeding from his backside and that he was in a bad way, but when a cop turned up, Dahmer said the kid was his boyfriend. The cop didn't even think to investigate. Unbelievably, despite the women's protests, the cop told Dahmer to wrap the kid up and take him back home. That he dutifully did, and injected the kid's brain again with more acid. This time he died, Dahmer kept the skull and added it to his skull collection. He killed again and again, and not surprisingly, the neighbors complained of a stink and also noise pollution, saying that some dude uses a chainsaw at night indoors. Dahmer had so many body parts, and sometimes he would leave the fresh dead around so long he got a maggot infestation. With one body, he tried keeping it for weeks in water and salt so he could keep it fully intact, but that didn't work. It should be known that Jeff kept cuts of human flesh and organs in the fridge so he could eat them later. There's even a story in the media about one of his neighbors who to this day thinks the meat sandwich Dahmer gave her could have been human meat. Dahmer finally met his match with a man called Tracy Edwards, whom Dahmer almost killed, but the sensible Edwards, who was 32 at the time, knew what was coming. He assured Dahmer he wasn't going to leave him, even though Dahmer had picked up a knife, used handcuffs on him, on only one hand, and Edwards knew what the foul smell was and what the steel drum had been used for. He stayed with Dahmer 5 hours with a swinging handcuff, as Dahmer occasionally held a knife to him and even said he was going to eat his heart. When he got his chance, Edwards punched Dahmer and ran for it. He told cops what had happened and what he had seen, and 2 cops went to Dahmer's place. There they found the Polaroids, with an astonished cop telling his partner that they were certainly not fakes. Dahmer tried to fight but was held down, whereupon a search was performed and a fresh head with flesh was quickly found. Dahmer then told the stunned cops, "For what I did, I should be dead." Investigators searching the house later found hearts, other organs, hands, penises, bits of tissue, an entire torso, skeletons, and of course, skulls. For his handiwork, he got 15 consecutive life terms in prison. He admitted everything and every detail, some say so he would get away with being insane. That didn't happen. Psychiatrists said he was sadistic and had antisocial personality disorder, but he was sane. They also said he was amiable, charming, and amusing to chat with. Inside prison, he read a lot of books and turned to religion, and even though he'd been separated from the general population, he persuaded the authorities to move him with the others. That was Dahmer's downfall, as he was murdered by fellow inmate and fellow murderer Christopher Scarver with a metal bar from the weight room. Scarver killed another guy too. Dahmer's killer later told the press that he wasn't happy about what Dahmer had done, but was also bugged out that Dahmer would make what looked like several body parts from the prison food as a way to piss off other prisoners. It's even said he added ketchup to his macabre art to imitate blood. We'll leave you with a Dahmer quote. "The killing was a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that. That's why I tried to create living zombies with uric acid in the drill, but it never worked. No, the killing was not the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control, not having to consider their wishes, being able to keep them there as long as I wanted." This was a long show, but we think the crazy story of Dahmer deserves it. Countless plays, books, films, TV shows, and documentaries have been made about this man.
Soon, cops will raid Edward Gein's house, and what they'll find there won't just disturb them, it'll break them. Many will never be the same after that. But today, Edward scoops one last spoonful of soup from the bowl he's fashioned from a human skull. He then empties the remnants of the soup into a wastebasket made from skin. Today's a big day for Ed. He's finally finished stitching together a very special suit he's made. Illuminated by the light of a lamp that's covered with what looks like faces, Ed first slips on a pair of leggings that look like legs, and next he slips onto his corset, a garment that once served as part of the torso of a woman. He pulls everything tight with a belt decorated with, you guessed it, bits of what used to be a person. He's almost ready now. There's just one last piece of his new outfit to put on, a human face mask. He looks in the mirror and thinks, perfect. He's finally become his mother. His masterpiece is complete. Reeling with joy, he runs into the garden and dances under a full moon. We're talking now about possibly the strangest serial killer to have ever walked the planet. His story is like no other. Ed was truly unique in his depravity, and that's why he inspired movies such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs. But if there's one movie that fits Ed's life like a glove, it's Psycho. We're sure you'll agree with us after you've watched the story that Mr. Edward Gein was a true American psycho. The question is, how did he get away with his crimes for so long? Did no one in that small town of his not wonder if there was anything a little bit strange about the man? His entire house was full of things made from human body parts. To do that, he needed quite the stock of bodies. How did he get them? How did he manage to do it without the local cops noticing? But first, let's go back in time and talk about the young Ed Gein. How did a young man become such a monster? A guy that would become known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in a place called La Crosse County in the state of Wisconsin. His parents, George and Augusta, had one other son named Henry. Life wasn't easy for the family. George couldn't hold down a job for long and support his wife and sons for the simple fact that he devoted much of his time to something other than family. That thing was whiskey. Augusta, someone who you might call a controlling matriarch, wasn't happy with the life she had. To try and improve matters, she made the decision to move the family across counties to the small rural village of Plainfield. There, they would work on an isolated farm, barely ever seeing the 700 or so other residents of the village. The two boys went to the local school, but it seemed to the teachers that there was something wrong with the boys. Ed had this habit of just laughing out loud for no good reason. He didn't have many friends, and even if he did make friends, his mother would soon put a stop to the relationship. You see, to understand Ed's later behavior, you really need to know a thing or two about his mother. She might have had an alcoholic husband who often returned home stinking of demon liquor, a man who could barely put food on the table. But she was no angel herself. She not only despised her own husband, but she despised everyone besides her kids. The only reason she didn't ask for a divorce was that it was against her religious beliefs. When not in school, both Ed and Henry weren't allowed off the farm. Augusta's reasoning was that most people were evil. She preached to the boys daily about the depravity of mankind, reading chapters from the Bible about the fires of hell awaiting most folks. She told her kids that those who take to the bottle will meet with eternal damnation. She told them that women were loose, that they couldn't be trusted, and that they too would one day have a date with the devil. Of course, Augusta said she was not one of those women. She was moral. She had committed herself to God. Her Bible was her blueprint for life. We don't need to tell you that this kind of overbearing mothering isn't great for kids, especially when you throw demons and hellfire into the mix. We'll get to the crime soon, but you need to know a little bit more about Ed's pre-skin suit life. The whiskey eventually killed George when Ed and Henry were in their 30s. After that, both men worked on the farm and did odd jobs around the village to make ends meet. They did handiwork for locals, but something Ed really enjoyed doing was babysitting. Yep, the Butcher of Plainfield was great with kids, likely because his own development had been arrested due to his mother's strictness. This is what one of the townsfolk actually said about Ed's way with the kids. Good old Ed, kind of a loner and maybe a bit odd with that sense of humor of his, but just the guy to call to sit in with the kiddies. And get this, people still sent their kids to stay with Ed long after his mother died. Some of those kids told their parents that they'd seen shrunken heads and strange masks around his house, but the parents dismissed this as the kids being over-imaginative. So Augusta still had a firm grip on Ed's mind even though the child had grown into a man. Henry had at least managed to get into a relationship with a local woman, but Ed was still too attached to his mom to think about other women. Henry would actually talk to others about how Ed was way too obsessed with their religious zealot of a mom. And when Ed heard this, he wasn't happy. He didn't want to hear anyone talking badly about Augusta. With that in mind, what happened when Ed was 38 years old might not surprise you. There was a huge fire at the farm. Firefighters were called and managed to quell the flames, and then they left. Ed later called the police department and told the cops he couldn't find his brother. A search party went out at night with their lanterns glowing all over the farm, and they eventually found Henry. He was dead. He wasn't burned at all. He was just lying on the ground with his face in the mud. Surprisingly, the cops said no foul play. The coroner said Henry had died of asphyxiation. He said that, even though it appeared that Henry had been hit over the head with something. Was it Ed who killed Henry? Did Ed want to be the sole benefactor of his mother's adoration? Most people think yes. Had the cops worked a bit harder, they likely would have prevented the rise of the monster. Not long after Henry's downfall, Augusta suffered a terrible stroke that left her paralyzed. Now Ed had to play nurse for his mother, with her shouting orders as her devoted son ran around doing all the jobs in the house. Nothing Ed could do could save her. She had another stroke soon after and died. To say the least, the adoring son of that Bible-waving beast was devastating. The house just got messier and messier, but not in one room. Ed kept his mother's room as clean as possible, making it a shrine to her. He also boarded up many of the other rooms in the house, with his main room being the kitchen. He still babysat from time to time, but his biggest joy was reading books about Japanese and German atrocities during the Second World War. He also had a thing for detective pulp fiction. Books back then often included gory stories of cannibalism in the Pacific. Ed managed to get by doing odd jobs, and he also enjoyed a windfall from some land he sold that had once been his brother's. What the locals in the village didn't know at this time was that Ed had lost his head. The death of his mother had traumatized him to the extent he was dangerously psychotic. He had become deranged, and there was no going back. We don't know the exact time when Ed started playing around with corpses, but it's thought that during the late 40s and early 50s he was grave digging and killing. He'd sometimes wait until someone had been buried, and then he'd sneak off to the graveyard in the middle of the night and exhume the corpse. He's now called a necrophiliac serial killer, which means he gratified himself sexually with the bodies before he got to work on making things from them. Let's now fast forward in time and tell you about what the cops saw when they entered the property and had the shock of their lives. A shock some people say killed the local sheriff. What he saw that day was so terrible, so unthinkable, he was overwhelmed with feelings of disgust, horror, and sadness. He died soon after from heart failure. It was the deputy sheriff that first arrived on the property. He opened a barn door, and before his eyes he saw a dead woman hanging upside down from a beam. To him, she looked like an animal that had been killed and was in the process of being butchered. She had already been split down the middle, and her internal organs had been removed. It was enough to make the cop vomit on the spot. Her head had been removed, and the tendons in her ankles had been cut and a rod thread through them. It sure was a sight to behold. Worse still, the police found her head in a burlap bag. Ed had driven a nail in each of her ears and fastened a string to them as if to make a kind of hanging trophy. There was much worse to come. The rest of the police department arrived on the scene. Now it was time to check the rooms of the main house. In the kitchen, they discovered Ed had likely been thinking about doing some cooking. On the stove was the heart of a woman, kept next to a bunch of cooking pots. Cops would later say Ed was no doubt a cannibal as well as a necrophile. And what really turned the stomachs of the town folks was that they'd often eaten packages of meat Ed had given to them. Did that make them cannibals too? Inside the houses, they found stacks of human bones. They found at least 10 severed heads. Some of those heads had the faces peeled off of them. They ended up becoming Ed's face mask collection. To make them more realistic, he'd adorned some of their lips with lipstick. One of the cops who saw those masks remarked that the people were very recognizable. One of the faces of a recent victim had only just been removed, and Ed had placed that one in a paper bag. The cops weren't anywhere near finished with their search. They found the skin wastebasket we told you about. They found chairs with human skin coverings. There were skulls with the tops sawn off, female genitals stored in a shoebox. They found noses, lips attached to a drawstring, female fingernails, a human skin lampshade, skulls on bedposts, and of course, Ed's pièce de résistance, his human bodysuit replete with the breasts of a woman. So after his arrest, how did Ed explain himself? He admitted that he robbed the graves of women. He wanted his mother back, and making things from the body parts of women was kind of like having his mother around all the time. By making a woman suit, he could actually become his mother. It turned out that those kids had been right, and indeed Ed had kept shrunken heads in his house. One kid, a 16-year-old who sometimes went to see ball games with Ed, said Ed always had told him the heads and faces were all stuff he'd collected that had come from the Philippines. That wasn't true. They were all local women. Cops did wonder how a man could dig up a grave all by himself in just one night, but when they went to the graves of the victims, sure enough, the women or most of the women were missing from their coffins. Occasionally, Ed would take what he needed from the body and later return the body parts he wasn't interested in. So, what led the police to Ed's house in the first place? That was because the police went to a local store and found a trail of blood. The blood of a woman named Bernice Warden. Ed had shot her and slit her throat, and then he proceeded to drag her body out of the store and take it to his house. Hers was the body hanging from that beam, and Ed had literally left a trail of blood for police to follow. The cops also found out from Bernice's son that Ed had been in the store the day before and said he'd come back in a day or two to buy a gallon of antifreeze. On the floor of the store, the cops found a bloodied receipt for a gallon of antifreeze. Ed didn't immediately admit to his crime, but the cops used a tried and tested technique to get him to confess. It was simple enough. They just made him look at the corpse of the woman he killed and mutilated, and in the end, he cracked. He also admitted to killing a tavern keeper he knew well, a woman named Mary Hogan. A mask made from her face was found in his house. At first, the cops didn't believe that all those body parts in Ed's house had been robbed from graves. What they thought they had on their hands was one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. But as we said, Ed told them about the graves he'd robbed, and he wasn't lying. He also said he only killed people when the ground was so hard from the cold it made exhuming bodies impossible. He guessed his grave robbing lasted from 1947 to 1952, and he added that at times he'd been helped by a man named Gus who stopped helping Ed when he was forced to live in a home for the elderly. We probably don't need to tell you that the Wisconsin State Crime Lab had never heard a story like this before. At first, Ed was reluctant to open up to investigators, but the longer he was with them, the more he talked. They listened as he explained the thing he liked to do the most was put on his tan skin suit, don one of his face masks, put female sex organs over his male sex organs, and then run around in the garden, especially when it was a full moon. That may sound about as crazy can get, but with only 2 murders under his belt, how come Ed Gein is called a serial killer? Isn't it 3 or more kills that gets a person into the serial killer hall of infamy? Well, it's generally thought Ed killed quite a few more people. Remember, he lived in a pretty remote area, and so we can tell you that other people went missing around the places where Ed frequented, and well, the cops thought he likely was behind those disappearances. Police found the genitals of girls in Ed's house, and it's now believed that they belonged to some missing local girls. It's also believed that Ed was behind the disappearances of 2 deer hunters who left the Plainfield Tavern one night and were never seen again. One of the missing men's jacket and his dead dog were found on the Gein farm. The judge who presided over Ed's trial later wrote that there was little doubt Ed had killed more than 2 people. That judge found Ed not guilty by reason of insanity and sent him to serve out his sentence at Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. It's actually quite unusual for serial killers to receive this verdict, but we don't think many people would disagree with the judge in this case. Ed Gein almost certainly had a case of what's called the Oedipal complex, a psychosexual condition in which a child desires his parent of the opposite sex. Ed's mother's fanatic talk of God and the devil and telling her sons that all women were bad except for her no doubt was the foundation of Ed's obsession with her and his exclusion from other women. He actually told the police in what they said was a chatty way that he was also obsessed with the power of women, but unable to actually be close to a living woman. He decided he'd surround himself with dead ones. He told police his victims were usually quite plump, just like his beloved mom. He always denied he had intercourse with the bodies, saying they smelled too bad. The cops didn't believe him, but were taken aback when Ed told them he took great pleasure in skinning women. The police said what was surprising was the cheerful, matter-of-fact way he spoke. It seemed to them as if Ed felt he hadn't really done anything wrong. Ed Gein died from lung cancer and respiratory illness in 1984 at the age of 77. If there is such a thing as an afterlife, he's probably quite made up since he's buried with his mother. There's just one problem though. Henry also takes up space in that plot. As for that old farmhouse, the building that was the inspiration for the house in the movie Psycho, it was burned down in 1958 while Ed was serving time. It was no accident, of course, but no one was ever arrested. When Ed was told his dear mother's house was gone, that his childhood home had been destroyed, he replied, "Just as well." Believe it or not, the nurses who were charged with taking care of Ed said he was a lovely man, although some of them said he liked to stare a lot. He was docile most of the time and proved to be quite excellent at sewing and other handicrafts. 78-year-old Samuel Little sits across a table from a Texas Ranger matter-of-factly describing how he took the lives of many of his victims. He's frail, wheelchair-bound, and has heart disease and diabetes. With armed guards around him, he talks about how he got away with over 90 murders in 19 states over a period of decades. He doesn't seem to have a care in the world, which is why he's been described as pure evil. From 1970 to 2005, this man traveled from state to state, covering much of the U.S. in search of vulnerable women that would satisfy his deranged needs. In 1971, in Kendall, Florida, there was a Sarah or Donna. He describes this Jane Doe perfectly and then sketches her face for investigators. He does the same for a 25-year-old woman he says he met outside a strip club in 1984 when driving to Cincinnati. Slight of frame, short blonde hair, blue eyes, and with a look of what he calls a hippie. Her fate was sealed when she got in the car. These confessions, with their detailed descriptions, and it has to be said, fairly accomplished sketches, not only surprised investigators but rocked the USA. The authorities knew very well that Little wasn't making it up. Not all his confessions have been confirmed, but enough of them have for the FBI to announce that Mr. Little is the most prolific serial killer in US history. Before we get into some of those cases and how on earth he got away with his crimes, what do we know about Samuel Little, the child? We know he was born on June 7, 1940 in the small town of Reynolds, Georgia. This is a place that right now only has a population of just over 1,000, with almost a quarter of these people living below the poverty line. According to Little, he wasn't exactly born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Describing his mother's job of being a lady of the night, it's thought he was born in prison after his teenage mother had been arrested for plying what some people have called the oldest trade in the world. At one point, she gave up trying to look after her son and ditched him on the side of the road. That's a reason why, when growing up, Little spent a good deal of his time living with his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. He attended Hawthorne Junior High School in Ohio, but it seems his grades were poor and behavior even poorer. He soon dropped out and set in motion what would become a lifetime of crime. At age 16 in 1956, he was convicted of the crime of breaking and entering and spent some time in a juvenile detention center. 5 years later, he was sent to adult prison after being arrested for breaking into a Lorain furniture store. For the rest of his free life, he moved from state to state, occasionally holding down jobs, but always committing crimes. It's believed that before the man hit 35 years old, he was arrested at least 26 times in 11 states. Those crimes included assault, theft, fraud, DUI, breaking and entering, solicitation, armed robbery, shoplifting, aggravated assault on a police officer, and more. Little did the police know, though, by this time he'd already started killing. By that time, the mid-70s rolled around. Stealing through the day and going out looking for women at night was how he spent many of his days. Those women were almost always African Americans living on the fringes of society. They were women who worked as prostitutes, or were addicted to drugs, or were homeless and living in shelters, or all of those things. Little once commented, "They was broke and homeless, and they walked right into my spiderweb." His modus operandi didn't often change in that he went to the places where the most vulnerable people could be found, and then he befriended women. Sometimes he'd offer them a ride in his car, sometimes he'd ask to go for a drink with them, at other times he tempted them with the promise of drugs. Once they'd gotten into his car, they had a little chance of surviving. This was a strong man, a muscular man who'd fought as a light heavyweight boxer. He'd often knock his victims clean out before strangling them, an act which gratified his perverse desires. Sometimes he'd stroke their necks, feigning intimacy, kindness, and then his powerful hands would tighten around him. His crimes shouldn't have gone on for as long as they did, but as you'll find out later, his choice of a victim was very likely the reason why he could do what he did and get away with it. He almost came unstuck at the start, though. On September 11, 1976, a woman named Pamela K. Smith was found half naked, her hands tied behind her with electrical cord. Pounding on a stranger's house door, she screamed and shouted until someone came to help her. This woman, a drug addict, said Little had picked her up in the city of St. Louis. They'd driven around for a while and then parked in a quiet area. Little attacked her. She managed to escape, and soon the cops found Little still in his car. He denied any kind of sexual motive for the attack and said, in his own words, "I only beat her." For that crime, he spent just 3 months in the county jail. Had the woman not escaped, that could have been a murder. Had she not been in trouble with the law in the past for her heroin addiction and failing to turn up in court on occasions, Little might have been scrutinized a little more. In 1982, a mentally disabled woman named Patricia Ann Mount was found in Forest Grove, Florida. This woman, who had an IQ of just 40, was last seen dancing with a man in a tavern. That man was Samuel Little. He was acquitted of the crime, with a defense attorney stating there's more doubt than there is fact. Many years later, Little would let the authorities know that he indeed had committed that murder. She wasn't his only victim in Florida either. Then there was Melinda Rose Lapre. Her body was found in 1982 in Pascagoula, Mississippi. She'd been dead a long time, so the body was in a state of advanced decomposition, which didn't help investigators. The night she went missing, she'd been working as a prostitute. When she left the streets in a station wagon, other women on the street saw the man who was driving the car. They gave a description of him to the police, and so when 6 weeks later Little was picked up in a traffic stop, he was taken in for questioning. Not only did one of those women pick out his image in a photo lineup, but another woman came forward and said the same man had assaulted her in the past. The problem was, prosecutors said there was no physical evidence to link Little with the murder. They said a positive ID wasn't enough to take the case to trial, so Little was allowed to go. An even worse blemish on the justice system is the fact that the district attorney's office said it wasn't happy about prosecuting a man when the only witnesses were prostitutes. Investigator Darren Versiga later said that the police back then were hesitant to believe assault claims from black prostitutes. Such discrimination is of course sad and patently unethical, but it's not that unusual, and certainly wasn't so unusual in the past. You'll see there's a term in the world of crime called the less dead people. These are the folks that serial killers often prey on. They're the poorest, most disenfranchised citizens, folks who can go missing and no one even reports it. Sometimes they end up as Jane or John Does, even if the police do have an ID. Due to their low socioeconomic status, and in some cases their rap sheet, they might not exactly drum up a lot of sympathy from the public or be the most pressing cases for homicide detectives. They were seen as less alive, less valued before they died, and so when they did die, they became less dead, even though you'd think they'd elicit the most sympathy given their difficult circumstances. This is how one person described how law enforcement sometimes treats the less dead. A great deal less pressure is felt by the police when victims of crime come from the marginal elements. Samuel Little knew what he was doing by targeting society's most vulnerable. He talked about it once in an interview, saying, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists. Nothing like that. I kill a journalist, it'd be all over the news the next day. I stayed in the ghettos." The FBI has since said that many of his victims didn't look as though they'd been murdered. Since he punched and strangled the women, police often thought the cause of death was a drug overdose or an accident or death from natural causes. Still, others have written that police didn't look hard enough, and that's because the lives the women had led. Perhaps rather than rigorously scrutinize the cause of death, a death of a woman with a history of petty crime or drug use was sometimes overlooked. If you look at Little's many victims, almost every single one of them fits into the less dead category. We'll get around to them soon, but first let's see how Little was caught. In 1984, he was arrested in San Diego. He kidnapped one prostitute and left her for dead on a dirt road. And then a month after that, he was found on that same dirt road with an unconscious woman in his car. Both women had been hit hard and then choked, but both of them survived the ordeal. A jury couldn't reach a verdict, and Little in the end pled guilty to the crimes of false imprisonment and assault with great bodily injury. He was out after only 2.5 years, then moved to Los Angeles. During this time in the City of Angels, it's thought he killed at least another 10 women, and at one point was arrested for possession of cocaine. He never turned up in court and then fled LA. He moved around yet again and had many brushes with the law, although because the warrant for his drug possession charge was non-extraditable, he was never sent back to LA to face the charges. It wasn't until September 5, 2012, when he was staying at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, that his web of crime started to become untangled. An LAPD detective named Mitzi Roberts had been working on murder cases, and she found that Little's DNA could be connected to 2 murders. He eventually was extradited to California on a narcotics charge, and it's there that DNA testing linked him with a 3rd murder. Shortly after this, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was in contact with police from Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Los Angeles detectives were talking to these people too, and it soon became apparent that this is the guy that could have killed the women from one coast of the US to the other. He was charged in 2013 for the murders of 3 women in LA. One had been found in a dumpster, another in a garage, and the 3rd down an alleyway. All 3 had been strangled. For those brutal crimes, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, all the time maintaining that he was an innocent man. It wasn't until 2018 when Little started dropping confession bombs. He was 78 and on the verge of death, and it's then that he started talking to law enforcement from various US states. These confessions solved the cases of many deaths police had deemed suspicious, as well as unsolved murders. Little had a good memory when it came to faces and how he'd killed each victim, although he wasn't always good with dates. What was surprising was the fact that he was able to accurately sketch many of the people he'd murdered. While cops might have suspected him to be behind a lot of murders, they weren't prepared for what he told them. They were in fact interviewing the most prolific serial killer in American history. There's such a thing as serial killers that have claimed to have killed many more people than they are convicted of killing. It's said serial killer Gary Ridgway might have killed many more than the 49 people he was convicted of killing, but that's not been proven. Richard Cottingham, aka the Butcher of Times Square, claimed to have killed 85 to 100 people during his 13 years hunting down women, but it remains to be seen if that's true. As for Little, it's now thought that he killed 93 people, but the FBI has said for now they can only confirm that he killed 60 women. It's likely he killed his first person back in 1970. The FBI had said this about Little's confession. He remembers where he was and what car he was driving. He draws pictures of many of the women he killed. It's very likely he did kill 93 women, given his honesty about the other murders and the details he could recall, although corroborating his stories is still a work in progress. We'll give you some examples of what he told the FBI. The reason the FBI has put these examples on its website is so someone might be able to help them with their investigation. Maybe some of our viewers could be of help after hearing this. Little said sometime between 1992 and 1994 he met an African-American woman in an area of Little Rock, Arkansas. He said it was a cold night and that it might have been snowing. The two went shoplifting together and Little was arrested for that. Police records corroborate the story. He got out of jail and went to move his car, which he said was a Cadillac Eldorado or a yellow Dodge. His accomplice was sleeping in the car. The next day, after driving down an old dirt road, he stopped the car and committed the murder. He told police that he dumped the body near a cornfield. The problem is, Little couldn't remember her full name. He said he thought her first name was Ruth, but he wasn't sure. He was also able to sketch her face. Then there was the African-American woman who he said he met in 1982 in New Orleans. He described her as being 30 to 40 years old, 5'8" to 5'9" inches tall, and weighing in the region of 160 pounds. He said her skin was honey-colored brown and her hair was medium length. She was in a club celebrating someone's birthday when they met. Little and the woman left the club in a Lincoln Continental Mark III. She told him that she lived with her mom and that her mom was either very sick or an invalid since the woman had to look after her. Together, they drove toward an area called Little Woods and took the exit off I-10. He said he drove down a dirt road where the canal was being dredged. He killed her and left her body next to the canal. He drew a picture of her, too. It was 1971 or 1972 when he met another one of his victims, this time in Miami, Florida. He said she was an 18 to 19-year-old African-American transgender person named Marianne or Marian. She was 5'6" to 5'7" inches tall and weighed around 140 pounds. The two met at a place called the Pool or Pool Palace, which Little said was on 17th Avenue in Miami. It wasn't until a few days later that they met again. This time the location was the historic Overton neighborhood. During these meetings, he said he learned that she lived with a bunch of roommates in either Brownsville or Liberty City. Little said he turned up at that house and one of the roommates asked him to go out and buy some shaving cream. He agreed and set off in his gold four-door Pontiac Le Mans. Except he had no intention of buying the cream. Instead, he and Marianne headed north on Highway 27. He said he stopped the car close to the sugarcane field and killed her there in someone's driveway. He then continued down Highway 27 until he reached the Everglades. He turned down a dirt road until he arrived at the river or a swamp. He dragged the body through the mud and the water and left the scene. These are just a few of the unmatched confessions. Others have been matched and murders have been solved. Although in some cases the bodies were never identified, so they're still Jane Does. It's uncertain how much guilt Little felt for what he'd done. Sometimes he smiled a lot while being interviewed. There was certainly no trace of remorse or shame in his voice or his face. He also once said he didn't fear God for what he'd done. "I live in my mind now with my babies and my drawings," he said in one interview. By his babies, he was perversely referring to the women he'd heartlessly murdered. He also said in that interview, "The only things I was ever good at was drawing and fighting." In fact, that's how he sometimes lured women, telling them that they were beautiful and then promising to employ his formidable artistic skills to draw them. He did just that to the victim in Odessa, Texas. He kept his promise, but she was already dead when he sketched her. Little died on December 30th, 2020. The cause of death wasn't reported in the media, although he was a sick man.
A once bullied nerd leaves a toothless head on a golf course. This isn't his only victim, and he gets away with multiple murders for years. A child whose brother was eaten by starving neighbors becomes an almost invisible killer, while another man, a respectable grandfather, would never have been caught.
had he not once explained what the backside of a human tastes like after 30 minutes in the oven. These men are 7 deadly sinners of the highest degrees, men who would have killed many more people had fate or ego not intervened. Number 7. One of the worst serial killers ever, and certainly one of the strangest, is busy at work in his upper management job at a government office in London. This is always a polite man and is well liked by the staff. And even though he can be quiet at times, he's a conscientious worker and boss. His name is Dennis Nilsen. As evening approaches on February 8, 1983, he has no idea he will soon be explaining how he killed people, many people, and that he often sat with the bodies propped up in the chair as he laughed and joked with the corpse about what he or they were watching on television. He neatly places his pens into his office drawer and announces he's going home, that is, to 23 Cranley Gardens, situated in a leafy suburb in middle-class London. At that moment, he puts on his coat, ready to face the wintry evening, and something strange and perplexing is happening outside his house. He's a clever bloke, Nilsen, there's no doubt about it, but my oh my did he get caught in one of the weirdest ways imaginable. Some say Nilsen's fascination with death and holding on to dead bodies crystallized during his time serving in the army. Some say it went further back to his childhood, and maybe he learned how to get away with murder when he was a cop. But it wasn't until he became a trusted civil servant in the 1970s that he really started to thirst for company. Not so much blood, more for friendships of the dead. Truth be known, he didn't enjoy the killing part. He really didn't enjoy the dissecting and dismembering bit, especially when the bodies were already in terrible states of decomposition. After his one true living love left his life, he started killing for company. In 1978, lonely and depressed but successful at work, he invited a guy back. He waited for him to fall asleep and strangled him. This was at his previous house on Melrose Avenue, number 195, a veritable house of horrors. One trick Nilsen had up his sleeve is that he was an alcoholic, and boy could he drink. He invited more young men back for booze, sometimes just tourists visiting the UK armed with cameras and full of curiosity. Nilsen got them wasted and strangled them. Then they became his friends. He washed their bodies, he stroked them as they lay in bed next to him, he propped them up in chairs and slapped them on the knee when something on the TV made him laugh, treating them like the living. But the problem with bodies is they bloat and they decompose, and Nilsen didn't much like watching Coronation Street with lovers who were stinking and falling apart, so he buried them under the floorboards. He later burned their bodies in the garden near a stack of tires. Local kids used to come around and enjoy what they thought was a nice man having another one of his bonfires. At night, he drank with the dead, and throughout the day, he gave orders in the office. He once explained his routine, saying, end of the day, end of the drink, end of a person, floorboards back, carpet replaced, back to work. But then he had to move house, and his new place, 23 Cranley Gardens, a lovely-looking 1930s semi-detached with Tudor-style exposed wood on the facade, was a large place but with separate apartments. That meant no place to bury or burn bodies. But as you know, serial killers aren't quitters. They can't quit, and Nilsen kept on killing. This brings us back to the beginning. When Nilsen returned home that evening, he found a drain cleaning company outside his apartment. The other residents complained of often smelling something terrible in the air, and they didn't know where it was coming from. But get this, even Nilsen had complained to the landlord about that. Yeah, go figure. So, a hired drain cleaner named Michael Catron started looking for blockages in the drains, where he too could smell something akin to dead animals. Perhaps he thought a dead rat, but then he pulled out what looked like bits of meat. And that's exactly when Nilsen walked up to him and said the famous words, "It looks to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." But Catron was pretty sure it wasn't chicken. In fact, he thought he found part of an eye, a human eye. He sent what he found off to a pathologist, while Nilsen went up to his flat and went about his life as normal. During the night, he was in his vest as snow fell outside. He was doing a bit of drain cleaning, but there was no way he was getting out of this. The next day, the cops were at the house. It was a human eye. They asked to look inside Nilsen's flat, to which the polite man did not refuse. The place stank. The cops looked startled. Nilsen then pointed to a wardrobe and said, "I think that's what you're looking for." He added calmly, "It's a long story. Goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." After being led out of the house, an investigator asked him how many. Nilsen, again in a calm voice, said 15 or 16 since 1978. There were bits and pieces of bodies all over the house. The police had never seen anything like it. One of them, perplexed later at the station, said, "Why?" Nilsen responded, "I'm hoping you'll tell me that." He killed 12 to 15 people, and the cops were never onto him at any point. Let's remember that many of his victims were young, gay, homeless men. To the police's shame, they were less than caring when those young guys went missing. Had the victims been wealthy, you can be sure the story would be different. And if it weren't for Nilsen's poor choice of flesh disposal, he might have had a lot more dead lovers. He died in prison, 2018, age 72. With this next maniac, his massive ego led the cops to him. Number 6. Bind, torture, kill. That's what this man was known for. The BTK killer confounded cops and made panic pervasive for almost 2 decades in America's Midwest. He later became Dennis Rader, but only after he left many bodies on the streets and had his fun taunting detectives. Again, the classic quiet guy next door who might have tortured animals as a kid and played with himself dressed in stolen panties while peeping through neighbors' windows, but as an adult, he was just another normal-looking family guy. Rader had a degree, he had decent jobs, he married, he had 2 kids. He became president of the church council and was a trusted Boy Scout leader. But my God, was this guy sick in the head. As a child, he kept detective magazines out near his family's chicken house, magazines that showed women tied up with ropes and knives at their neck. Young Dennis tied himself up and fantasized about killing at the same time. He was just 14. He later admitted even getting turned on by the Rocky and Bullwinkle show when the damsel in distress got tied up on a railway track. And so bondage and torture became the thing for this father of 2. He got away with it time and again, and the cops were for a long time not even close to solving the crimes. That was until 2004, when Rader was pulled over and asked, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" That's when things went wrong for the BTK, a man who thought he couldn't get caught. On January 15, 1974, he murdered a family of 4. They were the Otero family. He first cut all the lines to the house with his murder toolkit, ropes, knife, gun, and he broke into the house. There he found the husband and wife and 2 kids. At gunpoint, he told them they were safe and that he'd soon be gone once he'd gotten what he wanted. He tied them up one by one and killed them all. Rader wasn't just a perverted sadist, he was also a narcissist. That's why he hid a letter in a library detailing what he'd done. It read, in part, "I did it myself with no one's help. The code words will be for me: bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK." In another part of the letter, he tried to explain his madness, saying, "It's hard to control myself. You probably call me psychotic with sexual perversion hangup. Where this monster enters my brain, I will never know, but it's here to stay." He even talked about his heroes, H.H. Holmes, Jack the Ripper, the Boston Strangler, and other fiends. He killed again in much the same style, and again, this arrogant beast wrote letters. He committed one murder while he was on a Boy Scout trip, being a good role model to boys learning how to tie knots and make fires. Rader had some outdoor skills. Like Nilsen, he'd served time in the military. He'd even won a Good Conduct Medal. He killed another woman named Nancy and another named Shirley. He wrote letters to the cops with the titles "Oh Death to Nancy" and "Shirley Locks." He said in the former letter that he was driven by Factor X, a force only serial killers would understand. A killer who'd frustrated the police just as the Zodiac killer had done, then just vanished. He'd stay vanished for a long time, but Mr. Rader was not immune to making silly mistakes. As you'll see again today, ego is sometimes the downfall of murderous men. What's dark and unfortunate is that in order to catch a killer, it often requires them to make a mistake. So to get justice, the police in some ways need the killer to strike again. But Rader, he went completely off the radar for many years, so there didn't seem like there was any hope of catching him anymore. In 2004, the BTK became a cold case. But Rader just couldn't stop himself. He sent a newspaper of a photocopy of a driving license of a dead girl. He signed the letter Bill Thomas Killman. Later, he sent more letters and even a puzzle with one of the letters titled The BTK Story, and another along with a package titled The Sexual Thrill Is My Bill. In 2005, he left the cereal box in a pickup truck at a Home Depot. And although the box was thrown away, Rader told the cops what he'd written in another letter. It was then the detectives looked at the CCTV footage in the parking lot. They saw a Jeep Cherokee. He then had the temerity in another letter to ask the cops if they thought it could be traced if he sent them letters on a floppy disk. They replied in a newspaper article in the Wichita Eagle and said no, they couldn't trace that. Rader was no computer scientist, and he didn't know whether there was metadata in the Microsoft Word document he sent them. It revealed the name Dennis and the words Christ Lutheran Church. It didn't take long to find a Dennis Rader who was the president of the church council, and lo and behold, he drove a Jeep Cherokee. DNA did the rest, and Rader went down. In court, his confession was likened to a speech at the Academy Awards. What a narcissist he was. But in the end, his self-adoration put him behind bars. Like Nilsen, he could likely have killed many more and gotten away with it. Now, for a maniac like no other, arguably the sickest man that's ever lived. Number 5. The story of Albert Fish, once heard, can never be forgotten. The story of a seemingly kindly grandpa who committed crimes that would have made Jack the Ripper blush, that might have compelled Ted Bundy to proffer words of concern. He was also another man that thought he was too clever to get caught. Mr. Fish got off on not just inflicting pain on others but on himself too. When he was arrested, X-rays showed he had a total of 28 needles deeply embedded in his thighs and groin area. Not only that, he often beat himself with a studded paddle and set his nether regions on fire. He claimed to have murdered 100 victims all over the US, but we doubt that's true. Still, he definitely deserved all the monikers he got, which included the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and without a doubt, he was the living version of the Boogeyman. At some point, he developed a liking for human meat, at times feeding himself and his kids on raw meat because that seemed like the closest thing. During this period of his life, he was seen by numerous psychiatric doctors, and all of them said he was sane, despite Fish telling him he had regularly hallucinated. If only they listened to him more. By 1924, still acting like the good dad of 6 kids, his psychosis got to a point that he thought that God was telling him to hurt people, often of a young age. But because he looked like a stable fella, working hard to feed a family, people trusted him. This was at a time when he kept various killing tools which he called his implements of hell. He murdered people in the preceding years, but we only really know about one particular murder. In 1928, he responded to an ad in a newspaper, an ad made by one of the sons of the Budd family. Part of it went, "Young man 18 wishes position in the country." The son wanted work, and Fish, using a fake name, visited the Budd family and regaled them with tales of being a single parent. They liked him, they trusted him. Fish told the son that he had a job for him on his farm in Long Island. There was no farm. Fish wanted to lure him there and kill him. He did later confess that he intended to bleed the son out. Bud, excited, ran out of the house to buy a new suitcase, while Fish told the parents that his niece was having a birthday party and would like their daughter Grace to attend. Delighted that this man had given their son a job, they said sure, yeah. The last time they saw Grace, she and Fish were holding hands and waving goodbye as they entered the dark mouth of a subway station. It was 6 long years before Mrs. Budd discovered what had happened to her daughter. One day she woke up to find a letter addressed to her. She was illiterate, so she asked one of her sons to read it. Here are some of the parts of possibly one of the worst letters sent in history. My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor. Fish went on to talk about how these people became cannibals and acquired a taste for human flesh, young flesh, according to Fish. This was all fiction, of course. Fish was just being a creative demon. He wrote in another part of the letter, he was roasted in the oven, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed, that kind of thing. Then he talked about his own taste for flesh and the time he invited Grace to his house and fed her strawberries and pot cheese. He said he took her to an empty house and prepared himself while she picked wildflowers without a care in the world. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. You can guess what happened next, especially when we tell you he used the word sweet and tender. He was talking about meat, not personality. The cops were not surprisingly shocked, and even though the part about Hong Kong could not be verified, the part about Grace looked like the truth. But Fish, too confident for his own good, had used an envelope with the letters NYPCBA on it. That stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. The police discovered that the envelope had belonged to a janitor, and he had left it at 200 East 52nd Street after he moved out. The landlady there said another guy had lived there but had just moved out too. His name was Fish. Detective William F. King got on the case and found this Fish guy who pulled out a razor blade after being escorted to the police station. He was easily wrestled to the floor, and not long after in an interview he admitted to killing Grace Budd and other young folk. Subsequent investigations found that Mr. Fish wasn't just a killer, but he was an avowed madman with sadistic impulses. He later admitted to not just killing but mutilating and drinking blood, after which he ate the flesh. That's when a newspaper rightly called him the most vicious killer in criminal history. At the trial, psychiatrists invoked numerous words, isms, and ilias, which most people had probably never heard before. They called him a psychiatric phenomenon, of which he definitely was, but he wasn't insane by the standards of the law. To think he would have gotten away with it had he not written that letter. On January 16, 1936, Fish uttered the words, "I don't even know why I'm here," right before the switch was pulled for the electric chair. Prior to that, he had written a detailed document as to the full extent of his crimes and passed it to his lawyer, James Dempsey. When journalists asked Dempsey about the contents, he replied, "I will never show it to anyone." As you will now see, other maniacs could have gotten away with murder, many more murders in fact, and they would have continued had the cops not been given the facts on a silver platter. Number 4. If ever there was a serial killer who a casting agent would want to play the devil in human form in a movie, it would be the British killer Peter Sutcliffe. Let's now talk about how he got away with killing for so long. The date was July 1979, and a police constable named Andy Laptew had just knocked on the door of a fairly nice-looking semi-detached house in Yorkshire, in the north of England. A woman invited him in for a cup of tea, and her husband Peter joined them. Laptew was one of the many cops who'd been looking for a man who'd been plaguing this part of industrial England for years. The police had so much paperwork for the case that the room where it was kept had to have a reinforced floor so it wouldn't give in to the weight. Somewhere in that paperwork, Sutcliffe's name popped up many times, but the organization was so bad it was hard to connect the dots. But when Laptew spoke to this man, he got a feeling that this could be the guy they were looking for. After all, he was a dead ringer for the police sketches compiled by some survivors of the attacks. When this young officer told his boss about this suspicious man, he received the loud reply, "Anybody mention photo fits to me again will be doing traffic for the rest of their service." After that, Sutcliffe went on killing. His MO was just about always the same. He'd sneak up behind a woman at night and bash them over the head with a hammer. After that, he often went to work with a knife, hence he got the name the Yorkshire Ripper. The women were often poor, with some of them selling their bodies on the streets in some of England's most run-down areas of Leeds and Bradford, places that looked as though they belonged not in wealthy England but some of the poorest places on the planet. This is one of the reasons why the cops were later criticized. Had the victims been well off, perhaps they'd have felt more pressure to solve the case. In truth, they tried hard, but their minds and investigation techniques were old. The case ruined not just the victims' lives and their families' lives, but it made the hardworking investigators so ill, some of them died from stress-related illness way before their time. Still, when at first it seemed as though the Ripper was only killing prostitutes, the cops seemed less than compassionate. When it seemed Sutcliffe had killed the first woman who wasn't a prostitute, unbelievably the cops issued a statement saying that the Ripper is now killing innocent girls. They were all innocent, of course, but that statement shows how the cops felt and how out of date their thinking was. As the years passed, more and more women were being found with similar injuries, but the police didn't always connect the killings. They had an innumerable amount of survivors coming forward, some stating this man had a definite Yorkshire accent and that he had dark hair with a dark beard. They actually interviewed Sutcliffe 9 times during the long investigation, but he was let go each time. After all, he was a working man with a wife and they shared a nice house. He didn't look like a killer. As you now know, it can literally be a fatal mistake to discount people who don't look like killers. Serial killers will look like you, like me, like your neighbor, and like your boss. Then in 1977, Sutcliffe made his fatal mistake. He was already many victims in, so this time he decided to choose the city of Manchester for his next killing, about a 45-minute drive from Bradford. He killed her, mutilated her, and left the scene. But later, he realized he'd given this woman a £5 note for services that were never rendered. Furious with himself, he drove back to this bit of wasteland to retrieve the note. When he couldn't find it, in anger, he almost took the head off of her with a spanner. Knowing how mean the streets were, the clever woman had hidden the note in a secret compartment in her purse. But the cops found it. Tracking a note isn't easy, as you would guess, and it took some pretty amazing police work to eventually find out that that note had been paid to someone who worked at a T&WH Clark Holdings, where Sutcliffe had a job as a driver. He was interviewed like all the staff, and when police interviewed him again at his house, his wife lied and gave him an alibi for the night of the murder. She didn't actually know about his extramarital murderous activities. Then the cops received a tape recording in the post. It read, "I'm Jack. I see you're having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you're no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." George was the lead investigator, a man who'd soon die from stress, but George was stubborn and he was convinced that the guy on the tape was the killer even though his accent was not from Bradford or even close by. The man was a hoaxer, and he later sent a letter to a newspaper that read, "I am the Ripper. I've been dubbed a maniac by the press, but not by you. You call me clever, and I am. You and your mates haven't a clue that the photo in the paper gave me fits." Even the FBI's behavioral unit, who literally invented criminal profiling, went over to England and said that man is not the killer. But those Yorkshire cops kept looking for the man who'd been dubbed Wareside Jack due to his accent, while Sutcliffe murdered more women. Then the unbelievable happened, even in a case already implausibly bad. One of Sutcliffe's buddies, who long suspected his friend was the Yorkshire Ripper, sent a letter to the police. It was marked Priority Number 1, and it read, "I have good reason to know the man you are looking for in the Ripper case. This man has dealings with prostitutes and always had a thing about them. His name and address is Peter Sutcliffe, 5 Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford, Shipley." Remember, the police had already interviewed Sutcliffe 9 times and had been to that house. He looked almost identical to the man in the sketches, and he had a Yorkshire accent just as some survivors had said. For Pete's sake, he even worked where the note came from. That friend even went to the police station soon after to say what he knew verbally, but it seems he was ignored again to the cops' utter discredit. That talk he had at the police station, which must have been noted in the station files, seemed to have not happened. The police later said all the evidence of the chat had somehow disappeared, and so Sutcliffe was preparing himself to kill again. He couldn't believe his luck. Even though he just killed a woman with a hammer and severely mutilated her, that murder had not even been connected to the other murders in Bradford. It was a carbon copy in a city that didn't have many murders. Sutcliffe thought he could just keep doing this forever. He later said God must have been helping him, but no, it was just shoddy police work. He killed again, even after being charged with a DUI. He then attacked a woman studying at Leeds University who'd been so scared she slept with a knife under her bed. Sutcliffe's buddy died from a heart attack, so he wasn't alive to hear that on January 2, 1981, a man had been pulled over in the city of Sheffield, not far from Bradford. It was just a routine stop at a police check, but the guy that stopped him was still in police training. He soon discovered that Sutcliffe's car had a fake license plate. It was then recalled that this guy looked a bit like those sketches he'd seen in the newspapers. Sutcliffe then said he needed to pee, and so before the cop took him in for further questioning, he was allowed to go for one. There, out of the view of the officer, he threw things over a wall: a knife, a hammer, and some rope. In the police station, they had no idea they had the Ripper, and Sutcliffe was sent to a holding cell without being searched. He not only had another knife on him, but he was wearing a V-neck sweater on his legs, a kind of undergarment that gave easy access to his private parts for when he killed. The next day, the cops went back to the scene after the constable had told the peeing story. They found the evidence and were soon interrogating Sutcliffe. He held out for a bit, but cracked in the end, saying, "The women I killed were filth. I was just cleaning up the place a bit." In court, it was incredible that the judge said this: while some of the victims were prostitutes, perhaps the saddest part of this case is that some were not. The last 6 attacks were on totally respectable women. Sutcliffe went to prison and then to Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital, a place where he was viciously attacked and lost sight in one eye after someone put a pin through it. He was attacked more times after that. He lasted until 2020 when he died of heart conditions as well as COVID. This next killer is straight from hell, and likely one of the most terrifying people you've never heard of. Number 3. On the morning of March 13, 2012, 2 Texas police officers go over to a man in a parking lot at a cafe in Lufkin, Texas. It's still early in the day, and it's a fairly routine stop after the guy had been seen driving a bit erratically. But little do those cops know that the man they're talking to is one of the vilest, unforgiving creatures that has ever been put in this sometimes wicked world. It will take a long time for them to figure it out, and not without the killer's help. His name is Israel Keyes. This is a man that tortured and terrorized, a man that was so unrepentant that he despised other serial killers that had apologized for their crimes. When your idol as a teenager is Ted Bundy, there sure is a problem. The term evil personified springs to mind, and it is only by chance that this evil was contained when it was. He started killing in 1998. He did his stint in the army and then started killing again. He had one thing on his mind while driving all over the US, robbing stores and burglarizing houses. That was murder, or what he called hunting. He often chose isolated areas to pick his victims, with campgrounds being one of his favorite places. And when you drive from one side of the US to the other and pick a few people from campgrounds, well, that makes the job of law enforcement pretty darn hard. When he brutally murdered Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont in 2011, he made sure their bodies were never found. According to Keyes, he shot the man and strangled the woman. He bought weapons all over the country, and when he bought chemicals to get rid of the bodies, he also bought them in locations far and wide. He paid only in cash, and he often kept his phone turned off. So how do you catch a man like this? Even one who is robbing banks and breaking into people's houses numerous times. No sooner than he committed a crime, he became a ghost. But at some point, he had to make a mistake. On February 1st, 2012, a young woman named Samantha Koenig was just finishing up her shift at Common Grounds coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, when a man walked in waving a gun. She did as told and handed him the cash, but Keyes had more on his mind than money. He took her out to his Ford Focus at gunpoint, her hands now zip-tied, and she fought and struggled, but with sharp warnings about the gun being used, she had no choice but to comply. And anyway, Keyes assured her that she wouldn't get hurt, that he was only after a little ransom money. At some point, he drove back to the coffee place to pick up her phone. Keyes then told her to send a message to her boyfriend. It read, "Hey, I'm spending a couple days with friends, let my dad know." Later, Keyes went to her house to get her credit card. That credit card, Keyes knew, was in the boyfriend's car, and so when he went to get it, the boyfriend saw him. Instead of confronting Keyes, the boyfriend went inside and called the cops. Keyes returned to his home, where he eventually strangled Koenig. Calmly, he drank some wine and then made some notes about his upcoming cruise ship trip close to New Orleans. He woke his daughter up and they went to the airport. The cops knew someone had used that bank card, but that guy was on the move, and strangely, even though they had a video from when Keyes took the girl from the coffee place, they wouldn't release it. 7 days after the abduction, news website in Alaska wrote this: Anchorage police say showing the video now would be purely for entertainment because besides containing evidence that could be used in a courtroom, they say the video shows nothing that would help them solve the crime. But as he'd committed numerous murders, bank robberies, and burglaries, surely they must have had a face on file that looked similar. Surely someone in the public would have recognized Keyes. Possibly, but in a book about Keyes called American Predator, the writer says it's possible that Keyes once went to Mexico for plastic surgery. He might also have removed the skin on the tips of his fingers. After his cruise was over, Keyes went back to Alaska with only a bit of cash in his pocket. He made a decision and applied makeup to the now dead body of Koenig. To ensure her eyes stayed open, he tied the lids with fishing line. After that, he took a picture of her and sent out a ransom note. To make it look real, he placed a new copy of Anchorage Daily News beside the body. Soon after, he chopped her up and threw the parts in a lake. He later drew money from Koenig's account in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, but when in Arizona, he was caught on camera. So when those two cops pulled him over in Texas, they had a guy fitting the description of the kidnapper. Sometime later, CBS News wrote, investigators believe Samantha died within hours of her abduction. The article also said investigators further believe the person responsible for Samantha's death acted alone, and we're confident that we have that person in custody. But at this point, those investigators really had no idea who they had on their hands. They thought Keyes was an idiot who'd messed up kidnapping. They had no idea he was a serial killer. He ended up telling the cops about his other murders, explaining that doing the deeds so far and wide made him virtually undetectable. In 2012, he was found dead in his cell. Close to his body lay a piece of writing titled Ode to Murder. Some of it went like this: the reality is you were just bones and meat, and with your brain died also your soul. Your wet lips were a promise of a secret unspoken nervous laugh as it burst like a pulse of blood from your throat. There will be no more laughter here. Yeah, this guy wasn't exactly a bag of laughs. But how many people did he really kill? It's hard to say, but investigators found a pentagram drawn next to 11 skulls in his cell. Under the drawing were the words, "We are one." Those 11 skulls, maybe they meant 11 victims. And let's be honest here, before that kidnapping, police had no idea who he really was, even after all the confirmed robberies. His name had popped up only in Washington state for the offenses of driving without a valid license and a separate DUI. Now for a disturbing case of a man who really knew how to get rid of a body, even though he was bullied all his school life because of his learning difficulties. Number 2. Viewers, don't ever bully people. It's always wrong. It's the jurisdiction of the stupid. And you never know if that person whose life you made a misery might one day put the head of a woman inside a paint can and leave it lying on a golf course. You could really put someone off their game by doing that. A head in a can would usually be pretty useful to the cops, but not when all the teeth have been meticulously pulled out. And not when the legs for that head are lying miles away and the torso and arms are swimming down a river somewhere. When all that happens, as did happen in this case, the pieces might not be put together for 24 years, and even then, the perpetrator had to lend a helping hand. On February 20th, 1989, this guy committed his first murder, and his victim was Heidi Bulk. When she was killed at the age of 25, she'd been working as a prostitute in the Manhattan area of New York City. Sometime later, as you know, her head was found on a golf course stuffed inside a paint can. One of the cops that worked on the case, not surprisingly, said it was shocking. The cop also said as the years passed, they never thought they'd arrest someone for the crime. This guy had gone to great lengths not to get caught, so despite his learning disabilities, he was certainly what detectives called forensically aware. His name was Joel Rifkin. Had he not told the police that he killed this girl and killed many others, he'd still likely be known to few friends as merely an oddball who wasn't very charismatic when it came to the opposite sex. This troubled and sexually frustrated young man might have killed up to 17 women, many of them prostitutes. Unfortunately, sometimes when the poor and most vulnerable people on this planet get murdered, there's not always the most energetic police response. That's why there's a theory of what's called less dead people, meaning such folks don't mean as much in life, and so in death they are less dead. Rifkin would almost certainly not have gotten away with murdering 17 middle-class students in New York, but to be fair to the police, he was also very good at not leaving clues. When he murdered Bulk by hitting her over the head and strangling her, he then used an X-Acto knife to remove her fingertips on top of throwing her dismembered arms in the East River. Taking out her teeth was also a testament to his forensic awareness. Soon after, when he killed another prostitute, Julie Blackbird from Long Island, not only did he do the dismembering, but he weighed the body parts down with concrete and threw them in a canal. He kept killing this way, mostly prostitutes or drug-addicted people whose existences were tenuous to say the least. One addict, 28-year-old Lorraine or Vito, was killed by Rifkin and then stuffed into an oil drum and dumped in Coney Island Creek. She was found by a fisherman, but notably her family took 2 months to even tell the cops their daughter was missing. It seems she was less dead to her family too. In June 1993, Rifkin strangled a prostitute named Tiffany Bresciani. He proceeded to drive her body back to where his mother lived to presumably take her apart. On the way, he stopped at a hardware store and picked up some serial killer necessities, tarp and rope. He then made the rookie mistake of leaving her body in a wheelbarrow in the garage for 3 days in the summer heat, which, as you will know, will speed up the decomposition process and create quite the stink. With that malodor starting to perfuse the nearby area, Mr. Rifkin decided it was time to make a move. He got in the car and started driving to an area which he knew was an excellent spot to dump a dead prostitute, but again he'd made the rookie mistake, especially for a man who'd become an accomplished killer. He drove in a car with a missing license plate, which for a serial killer is tantamount to the folly of a politician opening his mouth and speaking his mind. When Rifkin was spotted by state troopers Deborah Spergarin and Sean Ruin, and those blue and white started flashing, he knew he couldn't stop because he'd allowed that body to progress to putreficative stinkiness. At first he didn't speed up, but he didn't stop either. A high-speed chase ensued, which ended with Rifkin and his eternally quiet passenger being wrapped around a utility pole right outside a courthouse. When the cops ran over to the wreck, guns in hand, before they could even assess the damage, they smelled the familiar odor of a dead person. Rifkin was subsequently questioned at the station, and in time, he just told the cops everything, stuff they had no idea about. He even drew them maps so they know how to find the bodies or body parts. Some Jane Does finally got a name. Although the head in the can on the golf course was named Susie, her working name and the name she'd given Rifkin, it wasn't until 2013 that she became Heidi Balk. In 1994, Rifkin met another killer in prison named Colin Ferguson, a man who opened fire at a train in 1993 with the intent of killing white folks. He shot 25 and killed 6. Close to the prison telephones, they both started arguing over who was the better killer, and with 17 bodies to his name and an exemplary background in body disposal, no doubt Rifkin got the upper hand in that debate. But his troubles with other prisoners in the end meant solitary confinement. Presently, he's at Clinton Correctional Facility. He's due to see a parole board in the year 2197. Number 1. Okay, the last one. This is a very original story of how killers get away with murder. The killer's name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was arguably Russia's worst serial killer, although the killer cop Mikhail Popkov and the infamous chessboard killer might have something to say about that. Chikatilo possessed a rage from hell. He did indescribable things to his victims. He was Monster Incorporated, and he got away with it for years. He really shouldn't have, given that when he was a young man it was obvious he was a fiend. He was impotent from a young age, and some girls mocked his non-working member. This shame manifested into rage, and the angry young man groped his way through university while being roundly reviled. When he later taught Russian literature, he was a creep who groped his own students. He spied on young women, watching them from a distance as something stirred in his loins. He acted on that as well many times and was so removed from schools. If he started at another school, he did the same again. You might wonder, how did he even get another job? Well, the reason is connected to why he got away with so many murders. At the time, the Soviet Union and the Soviet education system didn't want to admit such criminals could come through the system, so it denied the wrongs that this man committed. And even when he started killing, detectives didn't look at a literature teacher. Former academics didn't mutilate people and rip parts off them with their teeth even when the victim was still breathing. Only wild animals did that. Sometimes these bodies were literally torn to pieces, which is why the killer became known as the Rostov Ripper. Chikatilo had by this point become a traveling businessman, which is an ideal job for a serial killer since bodies far from each other in a massive country like Russia can't easily be connected, even when they did start turning up in numbers, with utterly disturbing crime scenes. Moscow didn't want to admit Russia had a serial killer. It said that kind of thing only happens in the decadent West. But bodies kept piling up and Moscow had to face the truth. Soon there were hundreds of cops after this killer, many hanging around train stations where the majority of victims had gone missing. Operations happened where undercover cops were stationed on trains and around railway depots, but Chikatilo kept killing pretty much under their noses. One time he was spotted by an undercover cop at Donetsk station right after he'd murdered a woman. The cop asked him what those stains were on his clothes, to which Chikatilo replied that he was a mushroom forager. Huh, thought the cop, a mushroom forager with a nice duffel bag. It didn't make sense. But it was only by sheer luck that when another cop was looking at the names of men who'd been questioned, he actually noticed the name Chikatilo. He recalled seeing the name before, back in the day, related to a missing person. But this time, unlike the other times, the cop dug deeper. And guess what he found? He discovered that this traveling businessman had been kicked out of numerous schools in the past for sexually motivated crimes. He then saw Chikatilo's name had popped up again when there'd been a sexual and violent crime. No one had joined these dots in years, and now they seemed to form a picture of a violent, murderous maniac. Chikatilo was last put under some serious surveillance, and even though they arrested him right before he was about to commit another murder, under questioning he never cracked. and the cops really didn't have much hard evidence. He might not have done 1 year in prison had something strange not happened next. Police did something that had not ever happened in the Soviet Union. Instead of grilling him again, they called in a psychiatrist named Alexander Bukhanovsky. It was this guy that once rightly told them you were looking for an educated man, a sadist, who is likely impotent and hates women. Now the cops knew he was right, so gave him a bit more credit to the art of understanding the motivation of a madman. Bukhanovsky sat in front of Chikatilo and told him what he'd suspected, that he was a sad, lonely man, a man with a terrible childhood, a boy who'd been traumatized. Bukhanovsky didn't know right then that the Chikatilo family literally starved in famine, and his own brother was killed and cannibalized by neighbors, after which the mother blamed the bedwetting murderer-to-be. Childhood could not have been any worse by any human standards, and when the psychiatrist said this to Chikatilo, by the time the doctor was done, Chikatilo, now in tears, said, "It was me, I did it, I killed them all." He told the police not only about the murders they'd been investigating, but about many other murders they didn't even know happened. Then on October 15, 1992, Chikatilo was sentenced to death for 52 murders. On February 14, 1994, a bullet to the back of his head ended his life. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison.
There have been plenty of serial killer couples, but you could argue that the Brits had the worst of them. Couples like the literature-loving, psychopathic sadists Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who murdered children in England in the 1960s. While those two murderers were sick to the nth degree, sometimes taking photos of themselves with their dead victims, and once recording a female victim pleading for her life, Fred and Rose West could be said to be even more vile. These were not natural-born killer types, wayward youngsters lost in the madness of a killing spree. This terribly odd couple tortured, mentally abused, and murdered many young female victims in what certainly deserves to be called a house of horrors. Welcome to this episode of the infographic show, Fred and Rose, the sickest serial killer couple of all time. We should warn you that this is a horrific story that could be upsetting for some viewers. Fred West was born on September 29, 1941, in a small idyllic village in Herefordshire, England. Rosemary Letts was born in Devon on November 29, 1953. Can anything that happened in their childhoods explain their turning into torturers and killers? We think you'll agree that the answer is absolutely yes. Fred was the youngest of 7 children, and he was doted on by his mother. Some reports state that the doting went way too far, and his mother had an incestuous relationship with him. Although after his arrest, Fred's brother, Doug West, told the press, "None of us was ever abused in any way by anybody." In spite of this, after his arrest, Fred privately told a social worker he had slept with his mother but didn't think there was anything wrong with it. After his arrest, Fred told police that his father had relationships with very young girls, including his own sisters, and also taught him how to have sex with sheep. But Doug says these are just crazy fantasies and life was normal for the family. Fred also said he was made to cut the throats of pigs, something Doug also says is just one of Fred's lies. Another person who knew Fred as a boy said this about him. He was a bit cheeky, a bit mouthy, but that was the way these kids were. I would say that he was probably naive and easily led. But then, at 17, Fred had a motorcycle accident which left him in a coma for 7 days. Even before that, his IQ was said to be only 84. 2 years later, he was hit hard in the face by a guy after groping a girl. Fred fell 2 floors and his already damaged head was hit again. This could be vital to understanding what happened later in his life, as head traumas can do strange things to people, including affecting moral judgment and inhibitions. In fact, a document, unearthed, showed the family saying Fred's personality totally changed and he suddenly started lying, bragging, boasting, and stealing. Shortly after these accidents, Fred's 13-year-old younger sister told her mom that Fred had been raping her for 6 months and she was impregnated. When asked, Fred said that he'd been molesting girls for a long time, saying, "Doesn't everybody do it?" Fred never went to prison as his sister refused to testify in court. There are other reports stating Fred also impregnated another young girl who was a friend of the family. One thing is for sure, he was unbalanced, dangerous, and certainly became the black sheep of this farming family. And now, Rose. Allegedly, both Rose's parents were mentally ill, and her mother even went through electroconvulsive therapy when Rose was in the womb. It's possible this decision by British healthcare workers may have resulted in Rose becoming what some call a slow child. She also grew obese in school, was bullied for that, and had little interest in studies. Some people believe this was all because of the prenatal injury. Rose's mother, Daisy, suffered from extreme depression, the reason for those electric shock treatments. If that wasn't bad enough, her father Bill was said to be a violent, paranoid schizophrenic who beat the women and ruled the house like a despot. Rose was sometimes called Dozy Rosie. Dozy as in slow thinking. And young Dozy Rosie wasn't even allowed to play outside. They just walked around the garden. They didn't play in the garden, just walked around all sort of stiff-armed. They weren't allowed out of the wall, said one person who knew the family. Some reports say that the father would at times make wife and daughter clean the carpet with a toothbrush. After the murders, Rose's lawyer said that Rose was never fully honest about this time in her life, adding, "You know, there was this man in a dark cape and dark hat, almost a shadow, following her as a child when she'd walk. And that was about as near as she'd get." Other reports state that she was raped by her father as a child, and Rose herself told a court that she had been raped by 2 different men in her youth. In a recording with police, Fred later would say her father was making love to her. She was more evil than he was. The family eventually moved to Gloucestershire, and guess who Rose would meet there in the future? Prior to the murderers meeting and Fred moving to the same county, he met an already pregnant Scottish runaway stripper/prostitute called Rena Costello. Together, they moved to Scotland and she became Rena West. In time, Fred got her pregnant again and worked as an ice cream seller from a van. The couple then took a girl as a nanny, 16-year-old Anne McFall. Fred had seen her crying in the streets and invited her to spend the day in his ice cream van. Fred then fell out with drunken, violent Rena and moved to Gloucester after he killed a 4-year-old boy by accidentally running him over with his ice cream van. He wasn't suspected of doing it on purpose, but reports say he feared locals would be angry with him. He took the 2 kids with him. Fred next worked at a local slaughterhouse, which is where some say he developed a strange fascination with dismemberment and mutilation. 16-year-old McFall soon followed. Fred got McFall pregnant, and she wanted for him to stay with her and not with his wife, who had left him but returned unannounced. Fred wasn't keen on this idea and killed McFall instead. Fred later told police he'd even told his father about this. The story of Fred and Rena is a long and chaotic one, but she was dismembered and buried too. He told different stories about how both these murders happened, and like with all his victims, said he suffered their hauntings. At this time, he met a 15-year-old who had a thing for older men. Her name was Rose. The 28-year-old Fred met her while she was hanging around a bus station in Cheltenham. They became acquainted, and soon Rose was part-time nanny for Fred's 2 kids, Charmaine and Anne-Marie, who he had taken out of care. This took a lot of gifts and persuasion, but Fred got his way. Rose even introduced Fred to her own parents. The mother said Fred was a pathological liar, and the father threatened to get the social services involved. Rose began living in a home for troubled teenagers, but she then moved in with Fred, became pregnant, and was put on social care. She told the local services she would return home to her family, but she went to live with Fred instead. He was soon imprisoned for petty crimes, and Rose had her child. She was now looking after 3 children whom it said she violently abused often, once tying one child, Charmaine, the child Rena was pregnant with before she met Fred, naked to a chair, gagging and beating her. Charmaine's body was found years later, Rose having killed the young girl while Fred was in prison, telling the other girls that her mother had taken her away. Fred and Rose were married after all this, and they moved to an address that might be one of the most notorious addresses in UK history, 25 Cromwell Street. They had another kid, May June, but times were hard with all those children, so Rose began a new enterprise, selling her body. It said she slept with men for money that she met on the street, but also some of Fred's workmates, and sometimes men who were lodging at their house. This just got out of control, and soon she was doing acts for people with fetishes, which involved roleplay, being beaten, tied up. Rose would later say she was forced into these acts by Fred. Time went by, and now they had 8 children, some of different colors, as some of the fathers were clients of different ethnicities. Despite Fred being very much a maniac, some survivors who were abused said Rose was the beast of the house. She beat and abused the children, with some of them running away and sleeping on the streets. She'd kick and punch them in the head, even give them little cuts on their bodies with knives, and in all, the kids went to the emergency room 31 times for what were called accidents, and this is when they were really hurt, not just bruised up or suffering from bloody noses. One of her sons said she liked to tie him up. The Wests had a cellar downstairs where they would keep a mattress and instruments of torture, as well as ropes. On one occasion, they took one of the daughters down there. It's reported that Rose told her daughter afterwards, "Everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry and don't say anything to anybody." This girl, Anne-Marie, was one of the children not murdered by her parents. She ran away at 15 and later told the press about this, and also that her uncle, John West, had raped her at least 300 times at that house. She later told the court, "You must try and understand the regime of that household. It was very much sexually orientated there, and we were never told that anything that was happening was not a normal family environment." Once arrested, John West killed himself while awaiting trial. Even one of the lodgers who'd seen what was going on or taken part later killed himself. All in all, the Wests had over 100 lodgers over the years. So didn't anyone suspect anything? Well, the children were too young and afraid to do anything. The Wests did once pick up a young hitchhiker, tie her up and rape her, and the 17-year-old girl told the authorities. The two Wests were charged with assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. But they were only given a fine of 50 British pounds or around $63. The girl tried to kill herself after hearing that. We can't go into every murder from here, but they involved young girls being picked up from the streets, abducted, or invited to become a lodger. They were often taken to the cellar where they would be masked, sometimes with tubes stuck into the nostrils so they could breathe, and suspended in the air using a contraption. It's hung up like this, like animals, and all manner of horrible things happened to them. They were then killed. The bodies were almost always found with parts missing, toes, arms, feet, fingers, kneecaps, with a Home Office forensic pathologist said it was hard to say what parts were taken while the children were alive, or if all the dismemberment took place after they were killed. One of the victims was Lucy Partington, the cousin of well-known British novelist Martin Amis. In sad detail, he talks about her disappearance in his autobiography, Experience. Other lodgers, often from care homes, were sexually abused but got out of the house. As all this went on, one of their own kids, Heather, started telling other kids at school that her parents had quite strange sexual proclivities. Word got back to the children's parents about what Heather had said. Soon Heather was not seen again. The remaining kids told police and media later in life that their parents would threaten them if they said anything about what happened in the house, telling them they would end up under the patio like Heather. It's said Fred and Rose said this as if it was a family joke. They even put a table on the patio where the kids were asked to sit when people came around to visit the house. The rest of the children kept quiet. Things just kept getting worse though, even though the children kept their promise. But this was their downfall, because the brave girl did not keep quiet. Enough was enough. She told a friend what had happened, and the friend told her mom, who then told police. The girl was put into care with 4 other children. Fred was accused of rape and Rose as an accomplice, but the daughter wouldn't testify. This was 1992, not long before the words Cromwell Street were etched into the minds of the British public. Police could quite easily put 2 and 2 together when the investigation started. Fred's missing wives, missing child, rapes, kids going missing from the area. You didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure that something was rotten in Gloucester, but it was a long investigation. One of the children, Anne-Marie, even told the cops about the family joke, the one with the punchline that said you'll end up under the patio if you breathe a word. The police started digging. The bodies of 9 girls were eventually found buried in the garden and under the cellar, and one under the bathroom. Another victim, one of Fred's pregnant lovers, was found in the house they had lived in before. Police told the press the victims had suffered extreme, violent, and degrading sexual activity before they were killed. Even before this, Fred knew he was caught and even rang his mother and said, "I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." He initially admitted to killing only Heather, saying Rose was not involved in the murder. Police dug, and West, whose low IQ is evident if you listen to the interview tapes, slowly admits to more murders. At one point, he is asked if there is one more body, and he even slips up saying, "Yeah, 3 bodies. 2. He changed his story many times and eventually told police he had killed as many as 20 people, which has led to ongoing investigations in England and Scotland, and a strong belief West was behind many missing young girls. His son Stephen later told police that his father had told him that too. He never did say where all those missing bones were. He did once admit in a tape recording, "I keep souvenirs." Rose was later arrested after Fred changed his statement, first saying Rose was involved, then saying Rose was the only one responsible. He told police, "I didn't kill Heather, I loved Heather." He said he no longer wanted to take the rap, saying Rose was sick for cutting up young girls. He even said he had no idea about the murders until Rose told him much later, but on some occasions, he'd witnessed Rose torturing the girls to the point of death. We may never know the truth, but police did know from forensic evidence the murder of Charmaine happened while Fred was in prison. On January 1st, 1995, Fred West hanged himself in his cell while still awaiting trial. He left a note saying, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West, rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace, he waits for Rose, his wife." The courts heard at times from victims that it was Rose who had been the one who instigated the violence and pushed it too far. Another girl said that Fred had abducted her for Rose's gratification. One of their children even said he had witnessed Heather being killed. He said Rose had stamped on her head until she was lifeless, but that was many years after the trial. Rose told the courts a very different story, that she was forced by Fred to have sex with people and do despicable things. There are many different sides of the story told by many people involved. One book tells us Rose was not innocent at all, stating her warped and brutal childhood experiences meant that once she met Weird Freddy, 12 years her senior, she would find his behavior neither abhorrent nor strange. She felt comfortable and even excited by him. Former nanny at the house, Caroline Roberts, said they were both equally involved when they raped her. She escaped but didn't tell the police. Later she said, "Not a day goes by when I don't think about the girls who didn't make it." Rose was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life in 1995. She was attacked in prison, with her attacker saying, "I am a mother. I just can't live with someone like that. I hate her." Reports also state that the woman was annoyed that West received lots of fan mail. In 2017, it was said Rose was gravely ill, but the media did not know what from. The trauma will live on. In 1999, one daughter jumped from a bridge into a river, but was rescued, close to death. She later said, "People say I am lucky to have survived, but I wish I had died. I can still taste the fear, still feel the pain. It's like going back to being a child again." In the same report, The Guardian explains how Fred would kick his daughter in the head, wearing steel-toe-capped boots, that he gave one syphilis, and if they cried, he'd call them crybaby. The newspaper said the public at the time couldn't bear to read the news, and journalists were told not to go into details about what happened to those strung up in that sadistic torture chamber in the cellar. 25 Cromwell Street was demolished by authorities.
March 11, 2004. A Canadian family in Vancouver have just finished a delicious dinner of pork loin wrapped in smoked bacon when a provincial health official appears on the TV and announces some very worrying news. That meal that they just wolfed down might have had a secret ingredient: the flesh and guts of numerous murdered women, meat that might make them seriously ill. When they heard that news, one of Canada's most prolific and demented serial killers was in custody. No thanks to the Canadian cops who seemed to always allow this guy to keep on killing. Did they? That's doubtful, but what is not doubtful is that this is one of the most disturbing, perplexing, and nauseating serial killer cases in history. A story that might contain some extremely dark secrets. Robert Pickton was a meat lover. His entire life was centered around meat, almost from the day he was born. Seems he couldn't get enough of the stuff, and he certainly wasn't too picky about where it came from. Born on October 24, 1949, Pickton cut his teeth on the family pig farm 17 miles to the east of downtown Vancouver. As with many serial killers, his childhood was far from pleasant. To understand the extremely revolting things you'll hear in this show, you need to know what shaped this madman. He wasn't always a monster. Little Robert, or Willie as he was unaffectionately known, was molded into a beast by perhaps the worst parents a boy could ever have. Willie and his young brother David grew up on the farm, while their sister Linda was sent away when she was young. Her parents said the farm life wasn't suited for a young girl. They were absolutely right. This story is about Willie, but bear in mind as we tell you this tale that his siblings might have also embraced a dark streak. Willie and David slaved away on the pig farm from a very young age. Their father, Leonard, born in England in 1896, was a very violent man. He ignored the kids as much as possible, interacting with them only to dish out the occasional physical and psychological abuse. Leonard was not a nice man, evident in one story that Willie would tell police many years later. It was about this time that he was 12 and bought a 3-week-old calf. He liked the calf and made it his pet. Then one day he came home from school and it wasn't there. He asked his dad about it and he was told, "Oh, it must have got out." Willie replied, "How can it get out the door?" His father remained silent. Willie ran to the barn where he found his half-butchered pet hanging from a meat hook. He told his mother Louise, "I was going to keep that calf for the rest of my life and now it's gone." Crying, he told her, "I was going to sleep with it." He loved that calf, which was now a butchered piece of meat. Somewhere in the kid's mind, the trauma he experienced had connected love and violence, affection and slaughter. He would tell this story later in life as if that pet calf was the most important thing that ever happened to him. He explained to detectives that losing his beloved calf made him realize from a young age, life goes around and around. You're only here today, you're not here tomorrow. You should keep those details in mind, since Willie's actions later in life are still a matter of debate. His childhood might hold the keys to what is a very murky mystery. Unsurprisingly, these kids stayed away from their father, but their mother, Louise, born in Alberta in 1912, was also the embodiment of parental mismanagement. This gruesome guardian was loud, controlling, and obnoxious. She didn't look too good for her age, her balding head usually covered by a scarf, hair sprouting out of her chin, and her mouth containing just a few rotten teeth. She wouldn't have looked or sounded out of place in the movie Deliverance.
She called Willie slow, a boy she believed was not quite right in the head, blaming the fact that when he was born, his umbilical cord had wrapped around his neck and cut off his oxygen. All she ever seemed to do was shout at him. She was often heard screaming, "Get over here, now!" and he always came running. She worked both kids like coal miners, up at dawn every day to slop out the pig feces. 200 pigs plus the 8 cows the kids had to slop out and milk in the morning. Both kids stank like something rotten, since Luis never taught them the importance of regular bathing. Willie was taunted in school for that. The other kids at Millside Elementary named him Stinky Piggy, and when he got home, he was faced with more hard work, often witness to the slaughtering of livestock. Death was always around him, but blood and guts didn't bother young Willie. When the adults were angry at him, he'd sometimes go hide under the gutted pig carcasses. Forevermore, death, blood, and viscera would for Willie be associated with safety. The Pictons were very well known in their town, Port Coquitlam, population 50,000, for having one of the biggest pig farms and slaughterhouses in the area. If you wanted pork, L.F. Picton Ranch Poultry and Pigs was the place to go. When people visited, they'd see the feral, unwashed kids running around a house that always seemed on the verge of collapse. This they couldn't understand. Everyone knew the Pictons had money from selling land. It was as if they enjoyed living in abject filth. Pigs, chicken, ducks, dogs, and the occasional cow wandered around the house, leaving dirt and excrement behind. A farmer who lived nearby later recalled, "It was just one shack after another made up of scraps of lumber. I didn't go down there, it was so repulsive." Willie, who had a good memory despite his low IQ, later recalled how when he was 2, there was no running water in the house. At that time, his bedroom was a converted chicken coop where he could lift a floorboard under his bed and get cold water from the spring below. Despite the obvious maltreatment, Louise said she loved Willie dearly. She protected him from his father. She doted on him when she wasn't treating him like a slave, feeling sorry for her boy who was put into the special education class at school due to low grades and the fact that he looked and smelled like an animal and didn't talk like other kids who wore nicer clothes. Many of those kids were the children of doctors who worked at the local Essendale mental hospital. One of them many years later admitted, "We were all terrible to the Pictons, especially Robert. No one liked Stinky Willie in school, so he was surprised one day when a girl named Lisa started being nice to him." Willie was working in the store his family had on Shaughnessy Street in Port Coquitlam, a shop they named the Meat Locker. That day, he stared at Lisa, her face slightly unique as her mother was Chinese and her father Caucasian. She smiled back at him. The smell didn't repulse her, so he gave her a free hot dog. Many years later, he'd meet Lisa again. They'd become good friends. She was probably his only friend. Lisa would also hold some of the keys that we talked about that may solve the mystery of Willie. More on that later. Rather than waste his time at school, Luis pulled him out when he was 14. He continued working at the farm and also worked as a butcher, slaving away in the back, cutting meat all day. Willie became very skilled at this. One of the pivotal moments in his life came when his brother David was 16 and learning to drive. For whatever reason, David somehow didn't see a kid walking down the road. The kid was 14-year-old Tim Barrett, who was hit so hard the truck was badly bashed up. Seemed as if David had not even slowed down or braked. Instead of doing the right thing and telling the cops, David sped off and went to tell his mother. She raced out to the accident scene, looked at the kid, who she thought was obviously dead, and rolled him into a water-filled ditch about 10 yards from the road. This had a big impact on David and Willie, who already had a warped sense of right and wrong. Tim's parents, Philip and Lois Barrett, reported their son missing. His body was found the next day. The disturbing thing about this is the autopsy revealed he died from drowning, not the injuries sustained when he was hit, although there were significant head injuries and a fractured pelvis. Even so, the pathologist said those injuries would not have killed Tim. Luis was now a killer, David was an accessory, and Willie learned a thing or two about ethics and accountability. David and his mom were both exposed in the investigation due to a mechanic telling police he'd fixed the Pictons' truck. But in the end, Luis wasn't charged with a crime, and David only got 4 years probation after being sentenced at a juvenile court. Many years later, Willie would tell this story about how his mother pretty much got away with murder. In 1978, Willie's father, Leonard, passed away at the age of 91, the same year that a fire at the farm killed hundreds of pigs. Then, a year later, Luis also passed away. The kids, including the sister, inherited the land that was worth a substantial amount of money. They also each received about $90,000, around $380,000 in today's money. That was small change though. The farm and its land were now worth close to $1 million, or $4.2 million today. Willie, who was now 20, was suddenly rich, but he remained at the farm as his mother had requested in her will. Now all the animals were his. He still barely took care of the place and never really got into the old hygiene thing, but he did make some changes. One of those changes was taking care of the animals he loved. When his favorite horse, Goldie, died, he decapitated it and took the head to a taxidermist. Goldie's stuffed head was still on his bedroom wall years later when the horrors of the Picton farm came to light. Willie had never had a girlfriend. The girl in his family's meat shop, Lisa, was about the closest he'd come to falling in love. The puppy kind, at least. Willie was aware that girls were disgusted by him, the pig boy who smelled like feces. So he found pen pals. Pen pals didn't know what he smelled or looked like. Just prior to his parents dying, the teenager Willie fell for Connie Anderson, a girl he was writing to in Pontiac, Michigan. He took a few long road trips to the U.S. where he called on the pen pals in Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Louis. But it was with Connie, a rather heavy-set girl, that he found true love. The two were both oddballs and not popular amongst their peers. They didn't bother with bars and restaurants, they just drove around all the time. Willie spent 5 weeks with her, and they later got engaged despite never sleeping with each other. The only thing Willie had slept with until then was pigs he sometime had to slaughter. He seemed to have trouble differentiating women from swine, which may have been why he and Connie never reached third base. Fourth base, with Willie, usually meant the meat grinder. One night he told her he couldn't leave the farm forever. He had to go. Years later he told the police she was supposed to come up, but she never did. Neither did he ever go back to Pontiac. Well, that's life, Willie told interrogators decades later. Life comes around and goes around. And in between, for Willie at least, there's a fair amount of bloodshed and pain. He was almost ready, primed to kill, to become a slaughterer and a meat man who would shock the world. Back at the farm, Willie did something unexpected. He opened the place up to the Hells Angels gang that hung around the area. From then on, there were wild parties at the farm. The bikers turned some of it into a chop shop and held cockfights in the barns. For them, Willie was just a weirdo sitting on a lot of money. As long as he let them party, they were good to him. They called the place Piggy Palace, always dumbfounded by Willie's relationship with his pigs, especially his 600-pound boar that would run wild around the place. They called Willie weird and slow. They laughed at him behind his back, but they sure did appreciate the use of his place. It was through the bikers and the parties that Willie met many women who worked the streets and most of the rundown areas of Vancouver. They partied with the bikers, often given the substances that got them through their day. Willie was equally as kind. Well, he seemed kind at first. In the daytime, Willie would take his meat to West Coast Reduction Rendering Facility, where the non-edible parts would be rendered into grease to make soap, candy, and cosmetics. Some of it was turned into pet food. Unbeknownst to the facility, it might have been part human. At nighttime, the parties would get louder and louder. This was kind of legal. In 1996, Willie and David registered a non-profit organization they named Piggy Palace Good Times Society, stating that it was for special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions. It was more like a rave organization in which the brothers used a converted building at the pig farm for hundreds of people to party in, including a regular cast of downtown Vancouver's East Side prostitutes. One of the parties drew 1,800 people. Young folks danced away the night, oblivious to the danger they were in. It was fertile ground for a serial killer. The brothers fell foul of the law a few times, sometimes for violating city zoning ordinance and other times for holding parties with too many people and for not writing up mandatory financial statements. But Willie didn't cross in the radar of cops for his more violent proclivities until 1997, after he stabbed a prostitute named Wendy Lynn Eistetter. Willie was now 48. This woman was certainly not the first that Willie hurt, but it was the first time he got caught. He was sloppy. Her experience tells us something about how Willie worked. He picked Wendy up on the street in eastern downtown Vancouver and offered her $100. She became suspicious when she saw a bra in his van, but she went to his house, which she called a pigsty. She later said something didn't feel right. She explained, "I asked him for a telephone book and he showed me a telephone book. And as I was leaning over the desk looking up a phone number, I could feel behind me." The next thing she knew, there was a handcuff on her arm. But she fought him, managing to pick up a knife, stabbing him near his throat. He screamed, "You bleep, you got me good." He subsequently picked up a knife and stabbed her in the abdomen. The next thing she knew, they were outside fighting near his truck. He had her in his arms as she pleaded, "I have a family. I'll give you $1,000 if you let me go." She said he suddenly became heavy against her body as if he were passing out from blood loss. She ran for it, leaving him staggering in the driveway. She was picked up on the highway at 1:45 a.m., seen by the driver Ben Streleski and his girlfriend. She was handcuffed, covered in blood, and holding a knife, quite a frightening sight for the couple. The last thing Wendy remembers saying to them was, "In case I die, tell them that I stabbed him in the neck." She didn't die. Willie was charged with attempted murder and released on a $2,000 bond after telling the cops she tried to steal from him and had gone bananas in the process. A few months later, the case was dismissed, which was not unusual for cases involving so-called women of the night. The cops later had to explain this to a disgruntled public, and they admitted they dropped the cases because such women with addiction problems didn't make good witnesses. This would come back to bite the Canadian police big time. Many prostitutes went to the farm. They often knew something dark lurked amongst the piles of animal excrement and broken shacks. They'd heard about Weird Willie, who mostly kept a low profile at the parties. It was common knowledge amongst the sex workers that Piggy Palace was a dangerous place, but they went there anyway, knowing the booze and whatever else often came free, or at least for favors. When they arrived there for the first time, they were greeted by a sign at the farm entrance that read, "This property protected by Pitbull with AIDS." Willie couldn't even get the English right. One woman who went there one time later said that farm was the dregs of the earth. It was a hellhole. She said women went anyway just for what was on offer. She said the cops always knew about what went on there, but they left the place alone for some reason. They could have shut it down whenever they wanted to, but they didn't. Many women who survived that farm still wonder why. In the 1980s and the 1990s, scores of women went missing in Vancouver, many of whom worked the streets at night. Such women have been called the less dead, meaning that when they die, no one really cares about them. In the eyes of society, they hardly existed when they were alive, and when they went missing, they still barely existed. They were less dead in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of conventional society, despite their vulnerability and hardships. After all, they hung out on the east side of downtown, a place known as Low Track and Canada's Skid Row. This 10-block section of the city was an absolute wasteland, where the sidewalks were covered with the rubber and spiked jetsam the women in the attics had dumped in the night. Pimps strolled among the many liquor stores and pawn shops. Biker gangs and Asian cartels openly flaunted their wares. Oddballs like Willie were invisible in this civic failure. Within those 10 blocks were the highest rates of HIV infection in the whole of North America. Young runaways, sometimes referred to as Twinkies, would often end up there. It was the last stop on the line of a broken life for many, the plug hole of society that sucked in the tormented and traumatized. No gutter was deeper and dirtier than the east side of downtown. These mean streets were a neglected and rejected gaping wound oozing human pus that presented some troubling questions about modern Western society. And because of Willie and his victims, soon those questions would have to be confronted. The women talked amongst themselves about this girl or that girl who went out for a job and never returned. The pimps started to wonder what was going on when this happened time and again. We're not talking about a handful of women here. We're talking about dozens of women over the years. One of them was Rebecca Guno, who on a hot summer's day in 1983 vanished from downtown East Side, never to be seen again. By the time Vancouver's World Fair happened in 1986, aka Expo 86, more women had gone missing. Some of them last seen at the intersection of Main and Hastings, the bottom of rock bottom. A face often seen lurking around that intersection was Willie Picton, the weird guy who held those huge parties at his rundown farm. 43-year-old Sherry Rail went missing, followed by 33-year-old Elaine Auerbach, who told her buddies that she was moving to Seattle but never arrived. Then there was Teresa Ann Williams, a 26-year-old Aboriginal woman who went missing in July 1988, but was only reported missing in March 1989. There was a hiatus of over a year until a 40-year-old psychiatric patient named Ingrid Suet vanished. In 1992, 39-year-old Kathleen Watley went missing. There was another break, and 3 years later, 47-year-old Catherine Gonzalez vanished into thin air. She wasn't reported missing until February 9, 1996. It took 7 months for 32-year-old Catherine Knight to be reported missing, who disappeared shortly before Dorothy Spence, a 36-year-old Aboriginal woman. That Christmas, 23-year-old Diana Melnick also vanished. The youngest victim at the time was Stephanie Lee, a 20-year-old woman who just vanished after being treated for psychosis. Tanya Holyoke was just 24, and Olivia Williams was just 22 when they disappeared around the same time. Unbelievably, a woman named Janet Henry survived a close call in the 80s with a serial killer named Clifford Olson. and on June 28, 1997, she also disappeared. After a 29-year-old black woman named Sarah Jane DeFries vanished in 1998, police found her diary. In it, she'd written, "I feel like I've come a long way on my journey. I feel like I've overcome a lot of stuff." Inspector Kim Rossmo of the Vancouver Police figured around 40 women had gone missing, most of them from the downtown east side. Even so, police still weren't sure the many missing women had been murdered. Rossmo employed a new geographic profiling technique, but despite the huge number of deaths, the case never became a major murder investigation. It was believed such women often go missing and then turn up in some other place like LA or Vegas. The cops were very wrong, but they didn't even have one body at this point. They had no forensic evidence. It didn't help matters that some of the sex workers and the gangs and the pimps were reluctant to speak with them, for good reason of course. The police then went to the families of some of the missing women in an attempt to attain their DNA. They entered the DNA into databases in North America, trying to match it with the DNA of Jane Doe's from Alberta to Arizona. They checked the hospitals, mental health facilities, drug rehabilitation facilities, and witness protection programs, and they came up empty-handed. These women really had vanished off the face of the planet. And as the years passed, 97, 98, 99, more women disappeared. Julie Young, aged 31, Angela Jardine, 28, Michelle Gurney, 30, Marcella Creason, 20. The latter was released from jail on December 27, 1998, and was not seen after. Her mother and her boyfriend waited for her at their apartment where they cooked her a belated Christmas feast. Some men were questioned, men who had a history of violence, but none of them, it seemed, had anything to do with the disappearances. The cops checked the Downtown Eastside Youth Activities Society's bad date file, where women had filed many pages regarding men to avoid. Willie's name was not on that list, mostly because if you met him, you were dead. One thing the police should have done is listen to 37-year-old Bill Hiscox. This widower had almost lost his life through alcohol after his wife passed, but his sister saved him when she helped him land a job at P&B Salvage in Surrey, southeast of Vancouver. The owners of this firm were Robert William Willie Picton and David Picton. When Hiscox collected his weekly paychecks, he had to go to the Port Coquitlam pig farm, which he later described as a creepy-looking place where the equally creepy and quiet Willie Picton parked his beloved converted bus with deeply tinted windows. But what bothered Hiscox was the wild parties and the fact that so many sex workers turned up there. He'd read about the missing women in the newspapers, and then when he heard about Willie's stabbing charge, he thought about something else. What he told the police hotline was all the purses and IDs that are out there in his trailer and stuff. Hiscox first gave that information to the hotline anonymously, but later he met with a detective, a man we'll discuss in detail later. That detective told him that he'd pushed the investigation all the way to the top of the police force, but after that cop was transferred off the case, the brothers were filed as persons of interest and left alone. The farm was not surveilled, which was a god-awful pity because Willie took a lot more women there in the 90s. In fact, cops were now pulling up names of missing women. There must have been over 50. Even so, it seemed at times the Vancouver Sun newspaper cared more about those women than the police. The cops were still unwilling to call this a serial murder case. If it were, it would have been the worst serial killing case in Canada's history. It took until 2001 for the police to finally form the Missing Women Task Force. By now, they had 54 missing women, possibly as many as 70, who'd all disappeared from the same area in the 80s and 90s. And so 18 years too late, Canada's largest murder investigation finally began. Even so, they still issued a statement to the public saying, "We are in no way saying there's a serial murderer out there. We're in no way saying that all these people missing are dead." It seemed to many people at the time, especially the women still working the streets, that the cops didn't want to admit they'd allowed a serial killer to remain loose for almost 2 decades. The Picton men's names stood out, both of whom had a rap sheet. They then looked at a 1998 report when Bill Hiscox had phoned Crime Stoppers about the farm. 14 more women had gone missing since then. Police noted that Hiscox had accused Willie of being a sicko. He told them in 1998 about those 10 purses he'd seen with his own eyes, and he explained that Willie had once bragged about being able to easily dispose of bodies. He explained a friend of Willie's, the mixed-race Chinese Caucasian woman named Lisa Yelds, had told him that she'd seen women's bloody clothing at the farm, as well as various women's belongings. This was Free Hot Dog Lisa from Willie's childhood. She suggested to Hiscox that the belongings might be Willie's trophies. Even worse, Hiscox heard that Willie got rid of these women with his meat grinder and possibly sold the meat to the public. That might have sounded like too much of a tall story back to the cops in '98, but in 2001, they realized they should look into this again. It wasn't until 2002 that there was a breakthrough, and even that was accidental. A rookie police officer was the first policeman to find something notable on the farm. It seemed the homicide detectives were still stalling, but this rookie cop got a warrant to search the farm for illegal guns, not pieces of ground-up women. He found the guns, but he also found a bunch of personal items belonging to women, including an asthma inhaler on which was printed the name of one of the missing women. So it was this young cop, who wasn't even on the murder case, that was the cause of the subsequent forensic search of the entire farm. A farm, by the way, that was worth about $70 million. Why this guy lived in such squalor, police just couldn't fathom. What they eventually found at the farm were the remains of at least 27 women, parts of them in the freezers and lots of them mulched up into pig feed. Worse, it seemed to cops that Willie had used human flesh and whatever other parts for pork products. Even so, it wasn't until 2004 that officials appeared on TV warning Canadians they might well have become unwitting cannibals. "Don't worry," said one official, explaining that they'd probably not get sick from it and they'd only possibly contract hepatitis B if they hadn't cooked the pork well enough. Given the size of Willie's operation, there were a lot of sick Canadians for a few weeks after that announcement, especially when the Canadian government ordered a federal health risk assessment study to understand if people who ate the part human meat could have come into contact with viruses, bacteria, and parasites, or contracted diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. Both these diseases were very common in Vancouver among the highly stigmatized prostitutes. They concluded the risk was low to medium, but that didn't make people feel much better. Willie had been murdering and selling meat products for 20 years, so God knows how many people were reluctant cannibals if he had put victims into his products. It was a great time to be a vegetarian in the Vancouver area. People asked how the hell police had let this go on for so long. They'd heard about his cocks and the fact that many women had died after he told police what he knew. Maggie Guile, known on the streets as Crazy Jackie, told the press 27 of her buddies were confirmed murdered and over 50 were missing. She added, "There are many more that the police won't add to the list. Whole buildings of women have disappeared, but no one's looking for them." Many of the victims weren't white, which led to accusations of racism and sexism. One thing was for certain, those women were less dead in the eyes of the cops. Now let's talk about Willie's interrogation. At the station, Willie is quiet, giving 1 or 2 word answers to questions, only to explode with vivid descriptions of his past when he starts to talk about his dead calf or how his father was harsh with him. To his interrogators, he seems a few sandwiches short of a picnic, as the saying goes. Willie refers to himself as the Pig Man, seemingly impressed when telling investigators repeatedly that his face is in the newspapers. At one point, he stares at the poster board with pictures of dozens of missing women he supposedly murdered and churned up. After being asked about them, he turns to Sergeant Bill 40 and says, "There's so many millions of people out there. They look so much alike, and everything else you know." Then he starts talking about how he was once mauled by a bull and another time chased by a black bear. Instead of discussing the case, he explains to the bemused cops, "That was a scary feeling, that one," referring to the bull attack. "Turn the other hoof, and if your arm's out there, rip your arm right off." Talking about once trying to split up 2 boars while fighting over a sow in heat, he excitedly explains, "I got in between them, and then they went after me. Got all slashed up." What on earth did the police have on their hands here? "Those are the good old days," Willie says. "Those are the days when I could say I got scars and really enjoyed myself, all black and blue." Detective 40 cuts in. "You do know you're never going back to that farm or that life." Willie then says there's nothing he likes about the farm anyway. Meanwhile, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were saying that in the last 2 decades, 144 prostitutes had been murdered or are missing in British Columbia, with foul play suspected. Soon, Vancouver will be sued for not doing their job. Families of victims will come forward to reprimand the cops, who certainly would not have acted in the same fashion had scores of middle-class women gone missing. The farm was fenced off as forensics did their job. It was thought many of the bodies had already been eaten or were possibly sitting in someone's freezer somewhere. In parts, anyway. In Willie's house, they found what looked like instruments of torture, kinky devices, and syringes filled with liquid. They found parts of a woman in a wood chipper. It seemed that Willie had strangled most of them, possibly after knocking them out with a substance, maybe windshield cleaner, after which he slaughtered them the same way he did his pigs. According to the court transcripts, he told an undercover police officer, "I filled the syringes up with antifreeze, and you inject this stuff and you're dead in about 5 to 10 minutes. He also likely shot some of the victims, and many of them had their bones cut with Willie's handheld reciprocating saw. But many of the women, the very last shreds of them, were missing completely, leading some people to question if Slow Willie was being set up. Canadian news outlets did not discuss the very worst details. AP issued a report asking anyone who may still have frozen pork products from Picton's farm to return those products to the police. More shock followed when a woman named Lynn Ellingson came forward and said she'd once seen Willie skinning a woman hanging from a meat hook. She was blackmailed by Willie and didn't say anything anyway out of fear for her life, but the friend at the time had tipped off the police. This friend told them that Willie made strange meat, and he explained in detail how Ellingson had seen Willie strip a body down. She told him she was surprised when she saw that human fat was yellow, not white. The testimony sounded like the real thing. Detective Constable Lorimer Schenner was the one who took the tip and the one who'd first dealt with Hiscox in 1998. But he said as much as he wanted to search the farm, he couldn't because it fell under the jurisdiction of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They apparently talked with Ellingson on 2 occasions, but each time she remained silent. Schenner later said that the RCMP visited the farm but were told to come back when Willie and David weren't so busy. For whatever reason, they actually did that. They interviewed Willie again, and he told them that they could search the farm, but according to Schenner, they never even returned. God knows why. The investigation was botched, with a capital B. Schenner said he had nightmares because of those missing women, and later he had to be taken off the case due to PTSD. This also slowed the investigation down, as Schenner was on to Willie more than anyone else was. In total, there were more than 40,000 photos taken of the crime scene. 235,000 items were taken from the farm, while the lab received a massive 600,000 exhibits. For the prosecution, 98 testified, and another 30 testified for the defense. It was a long and gruesome trial. Willie admitted to killing 49 women, but not at trial. He told an undercover officer while in custody that he wanted to make it 50. He was charged with killing 26 and convicted of just 6 murders. He was found innocent of first-degree murder but guilty of second-degree murder, likely because the jury didn't think the prosecution had proved beyond any reasonable doubt that he'd planned the murders. The deputy chief constable of the Vancouver Police Department apologized, saying in a statement, "I wish from the bottom of my heart that we would have caught him sooner. I wish that all the mistakes that were made we could undo, and I wish that more lives would have been saved." More people came forward to say they knew Willie. Some had survived the usually deadly encounter with him. In 1985, he picked out a sex worker named Tracy Bunyan. He took her back to the disgusting trailer, which she immediately saw was stacked with women's clothes. Willie physically hurt her, but then drove her back to the city, warning her on the way that he was giving her one more chance to clean up her act or she was getting it like the others. His belief that he was helping women was just an excuse to justify his perverted, murderous acts. There were other survivors, such as Lenore, not her real name, a self-described hardcore alcoholic who was in and out of foster homes all her childhood, experiencing the most horrific kind of existence a child could have. She said Willie picked her up in a white van, but when she saw the rear seats had been removed, she knew something was wrong. She asked him to stop the car, but he kept driving, and in the end, she had to jump out. She later saw Willie's face in the newspaper. In 2007, Judge Justice James Williams sentenced Willie to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years, meaning his parole date is coming up soon, in 2035. Willie is 73 now, currently serving out a sentence at Port Cartier Maximum Security Prison in Quebec, where he still claims he's innocent. In 2008, David Picton and Linda Wright sued the Attorney General and Solicitor General of British Columbia. They said the police destroyed much of the farm in their search, saying they disturbed, disrupted, killed, and destroyed various plants, trees, ground covers, and other vegetation. They'd been pretty quiet about their brother, which isn't surprising given that the 4 children of 4 victims had sued them, saying they knew all along what their brother was doing on that farm. Many serious allegations have been made against David over the years, but he's denied everything and filed statements of defense. In 2016, the book Willie wrote in prison, titled Picton in His Own Words, was published after the manuscript was smuggled out of the prison. The book was soon withdrawn due to the public outcry. In the book, he claimed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police made him a fall guy for the murders. He stated that some of the body parts found on his farm were in cars he'd bought at a police auction, and that some women were killed by the Hells Angels when he held those parties. He even claimed that the blood of one victim that police found on a mattress was nothing but spilled wallpaper glue. But before the book was taken down, a reviewer said it was incoherent, illiterate ranting. while another reviewer said, "It is tedious and boring drivel filled with tirades against the police, asinine theories about the Hells Angels." Nothing Willie says in the book sounds remotely true, but he has some conspiracy theorists on his side. They've asked why did the Vancouver cops not investigate the case for so long, even when they'd been told about the women's purses and a sicko who stripped the flesh of a woman. Why wasn't the farm at least put under police surveillance? If he murdered 49 or even 26, they say it's strange that even with the most advanced forensics equipment, they could only convict Willie of 6 murders. Willie himself managed to write to people from prison. In one of the letters filled with umpteen spelling mistakes, he said, "I, myself, is not from this world, but I am born into this world through my earthly mother, and if I had to change anything, I would not, for I have done no wrong." He also kept writing to the Canadian media, making cryptic claims that there was more to the story than everyone knew. Still, he never managed to convince anyone he was innocent. Willie was also a compulsive liar. He once told a cellmate that as a killer, he was bigger than the ones in the States, likely in reference to the likes of serial killers John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy. This might have been one time that he told the truth.
August 8, 1973, 8:24 a.m., Houston, Texas. An emergency telephone operator named Velma Lyons picks up a call. She hears what sounds like a young man say, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." Not long after, cops arrive at 2020 Lamar Drive. There they find the body of Dean Corll, a well-respected man known for once being the vice president of the much-loved Corll Candy Company. What police don't know is that this man lying dead on the floor will become known as one of the most depraved and prolific serial killers in history. He is the thing of nightmares, a real-life boogeyman whose crimes were so sick they were beyond sadistic. That young man who made the call and did indeed pull the trigger was 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, the poor kid who'd spent much of his youth huffing solvents and getting into trouble. He'd had a wretched existence, but he never knew dark until he met the guy everyone in the neighborhood affectionately called the Candyman. Henley, still shaken, told the police he'd killed Corll because of what had been happening over the last few years, something he played a big part in himself. That was to lure mostly disenfranchised teens into Corll's lair. Henley showed police what Corll called his torture board, an 8 by 2 foot piece of plywood which victims were held to by hooks. He showed them a set of tools, part of Corll's abominable and well-stocked torture kit. The police couldn't believe it when this young man described in lurid detail what Corll would do to his victims, sometimes for days, before they were eventually slaughtered on the board. The cops certainly thought the kid was a nut when he told them there had been dozens of victims tortured and killed by the dead maniac lying on the floor. That would make him the worst serial killer ever. Henley wasn't lying, but he hadn't even gotten started. Before we get to the absolute horrors that happened at the hands of Corll, let's rewind a bit. Dean Corll was a kid with health problems, and so he wasn't exactly the sociable kind, but he found his footing as a teenager when he started working with his mother and her second husband making candies. He just loved tinkering around with the candy-making machines, watching those colorful sugary balls of goodness come out the other end. His mother later spread her wings when she opened the Corll Candy Company in Houston Heights. She made Dean, then just in his early 20s, the vice president. In those days, what was called just the Heights was a rundown area populated by mostly poor white families. Kids ran around in the streets causing trouble, some of them literally with no place to go. In short, it wasn't far from being a slum. That's one reason why young folks loved to hang out at the Candy Company. It was a bit of color among the drab buildings. It provided them with just a little bit of happiness. Every day, almost on the dot, Corll would come out, his hands filled with broken candies that couldn't be sold. He'd give them to the waiting kids who stood there grinning with outstretched hands. Corll was loved for this act of kindness by the kids and their parents. Things were not as they seemed, though. Psychologically, Dean Corll had issues. He'd always been a loner and never had any real friends. It didn't make matters easier for him that he was struggling with his homosexuality, something he kept hidden due to the rampant homophobia back then. It wasn't until he was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1964 that he really was sure about his sexuality. It was during this short stint in the Army that he had his first intimate experience with a man. Still, when he returned to the candy company, he was not open about how he felt. People around him remarked how he flirted with young guys in the factory, and they noticed how animated he became when young guys would turn up to take the free candies he offered every day. They followed him around as if he was some kind of savior. Hence, he got another nickname, the Pied Piper. What the adults didn't know is that, like the tale of the Pied Piper, which has a much darker version, Dean Corll had something terrible growing inside him. He was going to do the unspeakable, and he was in the ideal place to do it. That's because the Heights neighborhood was renowned for being home to what some people called white trash. And this was in a city that in the 50s was called Murder City because it was so violent.
If you wanted to make people go missing in Houston Heights back then, let's just say that another petty criminal vanishing off the streets didn't exactly mean a lot to the police. The time was ripe for Coral, who knew very well that cops took little notice when a kid known for petty theft and inhaling paint thinners went missing. These kinds of kids were to be Coral's prey, and there were plenty of them around. At first, he just hung out with them. He installed a pool table at the candy company where they could play. He was surrounded by these young street urchins almost every evening after work. He didn't complain when they drank booze or smoked weed. To onlookers, the vice president was harmless. He was always well-dressed, well-spoken, and even though quiet, he was friendly enough. He was also wealthy, and plenty of cash in your pocket can often give a person immunity to scrutiny. This is what the mother of one of the murdered kids said about him. He was crazy about children. He let them walk all over him. He worked awfully hard. He was like a man that had nothing on his mind but success. It was when the factory closed that things turned bad. According to serial killer author Peter Vronsky in his book American Serial Killers, that was when Coral went out in search of victims. Because young men in the neighborhood had grown up taking sweets from the Candyman, they'd all trusted him implicitly. So when Coral drove around in his car or his white van and after pulling over said, "Get in, I have booze and weed," people did just that. At his house, he'd throw crazy parties. Young folks were handed all the booze and drugs they wanted and music blared for hours on end. Except someone would always pass out. It was then when they woke up hanging by hooks on the torture board, with Coral standing next to them holding something from his torture kit. We'd be demonetized if we described what he did to some of his victims' bodies, and to be honest, it's just too sick to describe. Let's just say Dean Coral might have read the Marquis de Sade. That's where the word sadist comes from, if you didn't already know. After he'd had his fun, which could take days, he would strangle or shoot them and then bury them under boat storage that he was paying rent for, or in some remote area near the beach. Other times he'd torture his victims in the van itself. He'd fitted it out to be soundproof so no one could hear the screams of his victims. He didn't have his board in the van, but he did have steel hooks attached to the inside. Some of the victims used to work at the candy company, so they may not have thought twice about going back to his house of horrors or getting in the van. But many of the victims ended up there because the guy we mentioned, Elmer Wayne Henley, along with another teen, David Owen Brooks. They told other guys in the street that free booze and weed were to be had if they wanted it. In a statement to police, Henley later said he was paid $200 from Coral for every victim, but he did not stay around for the torture at first. What he saw was Coral handcuff the kid and then gag him. When the victim was taken to the back room, Henley was dismissed. At first, Henley said he wasn't sure if the victims were killed, but later he certainly knew because he sometimes helped bury the bodies. Brooks also later testified, saying one time he saw Henley take part in one of the murders, and he knew exactly what happened on the torture board. What's even worse, some of the victims were Henley and Brooks's friends. Henley said he thought he was trapped and he was scared something bad might happen to him. He told investigators that he tried to join the Navy, but it didn't work out. He also said this, "I couldn't go anyway. If I wasn't around, I knew Dean would go after one of my little brothers, who he always liked a little too much." When Coral moved to 2020 Lamar Drive, the frequency in which he asked Brooks and Henley for new boys increased, as did the brutality of the torture. You'd think someone would have said something, or at least pointed a finger at Carol. After all, it was clear he only hung out with teen boys, and it was clear teen boys kept going missing. Such is the power of money and a nice suit. Coral was still admired in the neighborhood. Who could say anything bad about the Candyman? Now we'll introduce Rhonda Williams to the story. She was an attractive teenager who was engaged to an 18-year-old named Frank Aguirre. He was not into crime or drinking like some other kids and held down a good job. And then one day, he just went missing. Williams looked high and low for him, and he never turned up. Then one day, her cool neighbor, a guy named Wayne Henley, informed her that Frank had been murdered by the mafia. Of course, Henley had delivered Frank to Coral, like all those other boys whose faces were now on missing persons posters all over the place. Williams and Henley became friends, often smoking weed and downing beers while talking about the tough lives they lived. One thing they didn't talk about, though, was Henley's dark secret. One day, they were out on their bicycles when she got a flat tire. As they stood there in the street, a white van pulled up alongside them. The friendly driver was the Candyman, whom Williams had heard of, but she didn't have a clue Henley supplied him with various torture victims. In a cordial tone, Coral said, "Put your bikes in the back of the van and I'll take you home." They did just that, with Williams wondering why the van looked like some kind of cage. But in the end, Coral actually did do what he said he'd do, and Williams arrived home safely. He had no interest in girls. A few weeks later, and the date was August 7th. In the evening that day, Williams had a huge fight with her hot-tempered father. She was so scared she had to bolt the door to her room where she was hiding from him. Her neighbor Henley turned up to help. In tow, he had 17-year-old Tim Curley, who Williams had never met. Williams told them that she had to get away from the house or else her father might do something crazy. So Henley told her that he knew of a place where they could all go and everything would be alright. Things were about to get very, very weird, at least for two people in this threesome. When they got to Coral's house, things weren't alright at all. With a room door closed so the other two kids couldn't hear, Coral shouted at Henley, "You've ruined everything by bringing that girl." What he meant was he had $200 ready to pay Henley for his next victim, the unassuming Curly. How could Coral do his wicked business with the girl there? Henley told him about the violent father, after which Coral seemed to calm down a bit. He grabbed some weed and put it down on the table in front of the teens. Then he came back from the kitchen with a tin of solvent and 3 rags and said it was time to have what he called a huffing party. The next thing Henley knew, he was waking from a state of unconsciousness with his hands handcuffed behind him. The other two were tied up and gagged. Obviously, they had no idea what happened, but Henley knew exactly how things were going to turn out, maybe for all 3 of them. He saw himself losing his manhood on the torture board while the creepiest man in the world breathed obscenities into his ear. Coral then put a .22 into Henley's stomach and again shouted, "You ruined everything." The other 2 teens nervously laughed under their gags, thinking this was some kind of outrageous prank. With the gun at Henley's head now, Coral said he would have the boy, but for ruining things, Henley had to torture and kill the girl. Henley nodded his head and Coral removed the cuffs. The other 2 still thought it was some kind of game. Williams and Curly only started to understand the gravity of the situation when Coral removed all his clothes. He proceeded to walk over to the now wriggling body of Curly. At that moment, Williams' gag came loose, and still kind of smiling, she whispered to Henley, "Is this for real?" She looked for cracks at the side of his mouth when he said in a deadly serious voice, "Yes, this is for real." Henley shouted over to Coral just as he was beginning his cycle of depravity and said, "Hey Dean, why don't you let me take the chick out of here? She don't want to see that." Coral just carried on. Henley, seeing an opportunity, leaped to the side and picked up the gun. He pointed it at Coral and shouted, "Back off! Stop!" Coral, thinking Henley was his ever-obedient helper, returned the threat with, "Go ahead, shoot. You won't do it." Bang, 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 bang. With 6 bullets in him, Coral tried to move but collapsed dead in the hallway. His bloodied, stark-naked body slumped against a wall. Henley then made the call, "Y'all better come here right now, I just killed a man." After he'd untied Williams and Curly, he told them the truth, showing them the torture tools, the board, even admitting that if Curly had been killed, he would have gotten $200. When the cops came, Henley was read his Miranda rights, to which he shouted back in the cop's face, "I don't care who knows about it, I have to get it off my chest." 27 bodies were found in all, many showing the marks of the days of the obscene torture they'd endured before they died. There was likely at least another victim too. Even though movies and documentaries seem to mostly ignore Dean Coral, at the time this body count made him the worst US serial killer in history. Even now, he's virtually unheard of, which is strange when you consider the plethora of movies and documentaries about less demented and less prolific killers. Henley is still in prison today, not for killing Coral, but for everything else he did. The prosecutor said the crimes were the most extreme example of man's inhumanity to man I have ever seen. Henley might get out of jail in 2025, and if he does, he'll be 65. Brooks died in 2020 while still in prison. Curly and Williams naturally never got over the trauma of that day. Curly had mental issues throughout his life and was an alcoholic for most of it. In 2008, he died from a heart attack. Williams was equally traumatized, but she didn't fall prey to alcoholism. She said all her life after the incident, she wasn't sure how she felt about Henley. On one hand, he had led teens toward perhaps the most horrific death possible, and on the other hand, he had saved her life. In 2005, she turned up to the prison where Henley was incarcerated and decided to try and understand just how bad he was. He told her in no uncertain terms that on that day he'd almost shot her instead of Coral, and so saved himself from police capture. He would no doubt have also got $200 for doing it. That was all she needed to know. She walked out of the prison gates and told herself this dark chapter in her life was over.